Ladies and gentlemen, ladies and ladies and gentlemen, can I? This is not working, is it? Mark, these are not working.
Yeah, it's on. I can hear it. Yeah.
Is it okay?
Yes, please.
Great.
Try it.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. If I could ask people to take their seats. And thank you very much and welcome to the Toronto Police Services Board meeting, the March meeting. We've got a pretty full agenda, so let me start by calling the meeting to order and asking my colleagues if there are any declarations of interest under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act. Upala?
It's not a conflict, just want to declare that some of my colleagues from the mental health sector are on the deputation list today.
Thank you. Okay, colleagues, thank you. May I have a motion to confirm the minutes of the Feb 22nd meeting? Councillor Lee, seconded Ms. Shanta Casera. All in favor? Any contrary? Carried. Thank you. Item number 4 is a presentation, as is 5. Item number 6 has some deputations to it. Item number 7 is the organizational chart put forward by the chief. Motion to approve. You may, Councillor Carroll. Thank you. Item number 8 has been withdrawn. Item number 9 is the purchase service reorganization. A motion to approve. You may, Councillor Carroll. Item number 10, there are depositions too. Item number 11 is the inquest into the death of... Are you ready? 10 is deposition, so that we're holding that automatically. Item number 11 is the inquest into the death of Zoltan Hyacinth. A motion to receive. Councillor Carroll, seconded. Councillor Lee, all in favor? Any contrary? Thank you. Item number 11A is the response to the recommendations of the coroner's inquest. A motion to approve that as well. Councillor Lee, seconded. Councillor Carroll? Sure. All in favor? Any contrary? Thank you. Item number 12 is the response to the jury recommendations in the death of Mr. Eric Azawa.
Can I hold that?
You may. Thank you. Councillor Carroll holds. That's item number 12. Item number 13, 1, 2, and 3, there's a motion for that, and so we'll hold it. Item number 14 is the special constable appointments for transit and community housing. A motion to approve. Councillor Lee, seconded. Seconder for that, Ms. Muller. All in favor? Any contrary? Thank you. Item number 15 is a contract extension. Councillor Lee wishes to hold. Thank you. Item number 16 is request special funds, the annual community events. A motion to approve. Ms. Mulliner, Councillor Lee, all in favor? Any contrary? Thank you. The consent agenda, the item number 20, the 2017 proof of claim documents filed on behalf of the Toronto Police Services Board. Motion to receive. Councillor Carroll, seconded Councillor Lee. All in favor? Any contrary? Thank you. Item number 18, the semi-annual write-off uncollected accounts as of the July to December 2017. Motion to receive. Councillor Carroll, seconded Councillor Lee. All in favor? Any contrary? Thank you. Item number 19, Labour Relations Council and Legal Indemnification, January to December 31st, 2017. Motion to receive. Ms. Mulliner, seconded Councillor Lee. All in favor? Any contrary? Item number 20, the Annual Report 2017 Secondary Activities. Motion to receive. Mayor Tory, seconded Mr. Jeffers. All in favor? Any contrary? Thank you. Item number 21, there's a deputation. Item number 22 is the Annual Report 2017 use of CEWs. Motion to receive. Councillor Lee and Councillor Carroll. All in favor? Any contrary? Carried. Thank you. Item number 23 is the Annual Report, Toronto Police Service Audit and Quality Assurance. Motion to receive. Hold. Councillor Lee. Thank you. Item number 24 is the City Council site selection of new Consolidated Police Station 5455 Division. Motion to receive. Councillor Carroll. Seconded Mr. Jeffers. All in favor? Any contrary? Thank you. Item number 25, City Council 2018 Capital and Operating Budgets. Motion to receive. Councillor Carroll. Seconded Councillor Lee. All in favor? Any contrary? Thank you. And so that takes us back. Is there anything else? That's it? Okay. So let's start with the presentation. Number 4, that's the issuance of Naloxone and Superintendent Baptist. Is that who's presenting?
Good afternoon.
Thank you, Scott.
Since the meeting of February 22nd, there's been initial work done on the implementation of a Naloxone program across the Toronto Police Service, as was discussed at that meeting, as a strategic and structured. Hello? Okay, my apologies. Since February 22nd, there's been work done on implementing this strategic issuance of Naloxone across the Toronto Police Service, as was detailed in the board report of February 22nd. There have been a couple of meetings. At those meetings, work has been assigned. A number of different things have to happen for that, for this issuance to go out across the service. So, executive lead will be Deputy Chief Peter Ewan, Communities and Neighbourhoods Command. Central coordination of the project will be through myself, assisted by Inspector Paul McIntyre of 14 Division. Governance, the development of a procedure, the creation of associated forms, development of a tracking and reporting tool so that we can report back, etc. That's ongoing through professional standards, Analyst Emily Much and Staff Sergeant Catherine White. We're looking currently at procedures from across Canada where these things this drug is being issued to police officers, and we're looking for best practices. We have SIU considerations being reviewed by Inspector Ed Boyd, our professional standards SIU liaison. Training for prioritizing basic first aid training, and the rollout of Naloxone online training is being coordinated by the Toronto Police College through Sergeant Gary Heitzer and Sergeant Sean O'Brien. Procurement of the drug of Naloxone is being done through Rob Duncan, acting manager at Occupational Health and Safety, in partnership with Toronto Public Health. Logistics considerations and looking at the issuance, carriage, storage, replacement, that sort of thing of the drug. That's all being coordinated by acting manager Duncan as well, in association with divisional planners across the service. Medical oversight is being reviewed, whether we do that internally or through Toronto Public Health, with Rob Duncan again from OHS and Dr. Craig Windsor from Medical Advisory Services. A communication strategy is being developed by Acting Superintendent Chris Kirkpatrick of Risk Management Unit and Ms. Sandra Buckler from Strategy Management. All of these subunits have been directed to report back by Wednesday, April 4th. citing challenges that they're identifying, et cetera, so that we can try to overcome those challenges. And a board report is being prepared for your consideration, effective for the April 18th meeting. And subject to any questions, that would be my update.
Thank you, Scott. Are there any questions, colleagues? There is a deposition. I don't think Steve Lurie is here, but he has sent the written one, which you have in your package, colleagues. So any questions of Scott? Okay. Scott,
Great.
thank you very
sir.
much.
Thanks.
So, colleagues, a motion to receive. Councillor Lee, seconded Mr. Jeffers. All in favor? Any contrary? Thank you. That takes us to the quarterly update from the Superintendent, Staff Superintendent Bergen and Staff Sergeant Greg Watts on the Transformational Task Force, the way forward. And there are deputations afterwards, so thank you very much.
Good afternoon, Chief. Good afternoon,
You have
Chair.
to be a little closer, I think, Greg.
Good afternoon, Chief. Good afternoon, Chair, and good afternoon, board members. We're here to present the fourth quarterly update from the Way Forward report, but we're actually going to take this opportunity to talk about a bit of a year in review. By way of background, we're going to go over a quick background. We're going to talk about the foundation of the project that we've put together, a couple breakthroughs and celebrations, some obstacles, lessons learned, and then what we're going to be focusing on moving forward. So to start off, by way of a quick, very quick background, I'm going to take everybody back to 2 years ago when the Chief and the Chair put together the Transformational Task Force, which was really a bit of a breakthrough in itself in regards to bringing external expertise and internal expertise together to what the mandate is to develop a more efficient and effective model of policing for the City of Toronto. And one of the main takeaways from that was the development of our strategy map, which turned into our business plan moving forward. And just to remind everyone of what those three goals were, and that was to be where the public needs us the most, to embrace partnerships for a safer city, and to focus on the complex needs of a city such as Toronto. Frank Bergen, Staff Superintendent Frank Bergen, was brought into strategy management to run the implementation of the 32 recommendations contained in the report. I was then brought in to figure out with Frank what that implementation would look like. The first thing we did was we realized we needed to bring some external expertise in, because we're cops and we needed to bring in someone to help us figure out how to hold us accountable, which is why we brought Charlene Matthias in as a project director to really push us out of our comfort zone, to not just say, well, it's just the way we do things, or it's the way we've always done things, to push us in terms of industry standard of how to make this to achieve our goals of what those 32 recommendations are. We then embarked on putting a team together. Our team in strategy management consists of a wide variety of service members, both uniform and civilian. And I'd like to kind of speak to them for a quick second and to say thank you to them. Over the last year, they have undertaken the foundation of so much change in our service. And they've done that with a positive attitude every day and with a motivation and a level of commitment that is remarkable. So I just want to say thank you to our team at Strategy Management. I'm going to turn it over to Charlene now to talk about what the foundation that we put together is and that accountability.
Thanks, Greg. So the first piece I wanted to talk about was in terms of the team structure. So Greg spoke a little bit about the internal and external mix on the team. The other thing, the way the team was designed, is that intentionally by design, the service selected internal members to act in the form of a project lead for each of the recommendations or each of the initiatives. So the intent or the understanding is that the folks implementing and leading the change have a strong understanding of the business. And so my role became more of a support role in terms of helping the team incorporate the appropriate project and change management practices into their day-to-day. The other piece, sort of structurally, that we put in place was to develop work streams or categorize the 32 recommendations. So what we did was look across the 32 recommendations and take a closer look at the people, the processes, and the technology that was impacted by each of the 32 recommendations and group like projects together so that we could see where there's interdependencies or where there was need for better synergies across the projects. So for example, we have a technological improvements work stream where all of the projects that have a strong technical component are grouped together, such as the Connected Officer, the Business Intelligence Initiatives, or the IT Assessment. Similarly, we have another work stream for the new policing model or the district policing model, where all of the initiatives that are linked to the new district model are linked together so we can see and plan the changes accordingly. From an accountability perspective, we did a number of things. One of the first things we did was develop business cases for each and every one of the 32 recommendations so that we could better articulate the why behind each of the initiatives and get alignment across the expected outcomes for each of those initiatives. We also developed an online scorecard with the support of our strategic planning team and the business intelligence team. And part of that content on the online scorecard is what you receive in your packages each quarter, where for each of the 32 recommendations, we assess various project health indicators such as scope and timelines and budget and indicate how on track or off track each of these pieces may be, and if they're off track, why and what we're doing to mitigate, along with general progress updates. We have a number of other project artifacts in place, such as progress reports and logic models to help evaluate. But those are the main core pieces that we put in place at the onset of the project. The other piece is from a governance perspective. We started off trying to leverage existing project governance structures in order to ensure that we had appropriate escalation channels and got strategic direction from the appropriate groups across the organization. So there's an existing command strategy management committee that we leveraged, as well as the senior management team. We've learned over the last several months that the intensity and complexity of some of these projects, in combination with some of the new organizational structures in place, have needed us to revisit our project governance structure. So we're currently in the process of developing executive steering committees to more closely oversee each of the different work streams and projects that are in place for the way forward. I'll hand it back to Greg to talk about some of our breakthroughs.
So when we talk about breakthroughs, we're actually talking about some really great achievements that we've made over the last year, and that ones that we should take a minute to kind of celebrate. When I speak about service reallocation, one thing that is important to note is with regards to the certain services that the Toronto Police is going to be handing over to the city, such as lifeguards. We are officially out of the lifeguard business, which is a great win. And the next, when we talk about crossing guards, that's an interesting file because although the Toronto Police Service won't be out of the crossing guard business until next year, we have a strong shared commitment between us and the city that as of September, we won't be having police officers on crossing points, which is again, speaks to the partnership that we have with our city partners. In the final report, there was mention of moving from primary to priority. And when we say that we're going to move to priority, we can't forget how we're going to get there. And so with the creation of what we called our CISUs, our Community Investigative Support Units, which was really a grassroots initiative out of 43 Division Scarborough by Superintendent Fenton, it allowed us to focus on the lower priority calls for service and the tasks that need to get done that are of a typical lower priority than obviously the higher priority ones. That has been implemented throughout our city, throughout our divisions, and it's been an overwhelming success, so much so that certain divisions are actually enhancing and making their CISUs larger because they see the value in it. I spoke a second ago about partnerships, and very pleased to say that the level of partnerships that we have with our city partners is incredible. Right off from the start, the city manager's office embedded a member from their team onto ours. Vanessa Ferrone has been instrumental in helping us quarterback the many different city agencies and the city divisions, and it's been great. We have regular meetings with Tracy Cook, Gary York from MLS and 311 respectively, and again, that commitment is shared. Not just amongst our team here at TPS, but with the city agencies as well. We are working towards service level agreements to be put in place in April to start looking at certain calls for service that we currently attend, and to now start transitioning that over to this appropriate city agencies, such as landlord and tenant calls, animal complaints, and so on. So that's a very exciting initiative for us. In May, to go back to the concept of primary to priority, we created what's called the Priority Response Group, the PRG, which was a way for our service to handle surge capacity in each division. So when a division is experiencing high levels of calls for service, the Toronto Police Operations Center, the TPOC, can dispatch the priority response groups to different divisions as they see fit. And again, that has been there's been a successful initiative. The Connected Officer initiative, that's the exciting one. The 51 division is now fully connected, so over 200 officers have been deployed with connected devices, and that's been incredible to see. The scope of that project is really up to the imagination of the officers that have it, and they've been able to use it in ways that we didn't even foresee happening. We've embedded our team at 51 Division to deal with the on-site glitches and the day-to-day things that come up, and the feedback from the frontline officers as well as the management team at 51 has been overwhelmingly positive. And like I said, they've had access to information that they hadn't had before, and they have, are able to do their jobs in many instances a lot more efficiently and effectively.
The next breakthrough I wanted to talk about is in regards to our divisional boundaries. So the first big step in trying to think about how to change our boundaries is to figure out what the new boundaries should look like. And a year ago, we had no concept of how to go about doing this. We understood why we were changing our boundaries. We understood the business need around it and what the intended outcomes or expected outcomes were. But in terms of how to practically tackle going about this, we had to break it apart bit by bit. We engaged a number of subject matter experts, both internal to the service as well as external. We relied very heavily on our business intelligence team and the Environics tool to help us come up with what we call a layered approach, where we looked at everything from data and analytics to areas of the city with high policing activity to our current facilities, as well as the City of Toronto's current 140 neighbourhoods. Of course, along the way, we also applied a lens of experience or policing experience and common sense in order to help us develop our initial proposal around what the new boundaries should look like. We then engaged our senior officers in terms of a structured engagement approach and sharing what the proposal looked like, and gave everybody an opportunity to provide some feedback based on their own individual experiences or considerations within their respective units or divisions. We went on site with each of the unit commanders, and our Frank and Greg went on site with each of the unit commanders to solicit their feedback, and we then compiled all their feedback and revisited the proposal and presented something to command, which was signed off last month. So this was a breakthrough from our perspective in terms of coming up with some initial direction on what we think is a good option in terms of changing the divisional boundaries to align with the city's 140 neighborhoods. It's just step one. Next steps involve intensive engagement and developing some detailed plans, and we expect there to be further tweaks to the boundaries over the course of the way as we solicit feedback from the remaining internal groups as well as external stakeholder groups. But it's been certainly an achievement from our end to get us this far and get this direction. Next is the HR strategy. In previous meetings, you've heard a lot of progress that has been made in terms of some of the accomplishments in this particular area by the HR unit. A couple of those pieces include the introduction of new core competencies, the 360 and mentorship program. A number of initiatives have been launched already through this HR strategy, and several others are on the way. So that's another area of accomplishment for us. The next piece I wanted to talk about was in regards to culture change. So recommendation 24 speaks to wholesale change across the culture. And again, step one of this is understanding what the current state is. So we enlisted MNP, a consulting group, to conduct an organizational culture assessment. And that assessment involved at first taking a step back, and taking a lens around what the future state should be. What's that desired end state in terms of where we want to be? And that was sort of a picture was painted around that. And the next step was to conduct a very thorough internal analysis around what the current state culture is. External analysis was also done around the current state as well. And so currently the vendor is taking a look at what are the gaps in between that desired future state and where we currently are now. And we're expecting to receive the proposal the final report at the end of this month. And in April, the service will have its first chance to take a close look at what's involved in order to get us to that desired future state. Okay.
When we talk about obstacles and lessons learned, when thinking about how to really portray the last year of work, specific to obstacles and lessons learned, I think it came down to three main categories, and that was politics, process, and personalities. And those then funnel down into really communication and engagement. When we started this journey a year ago, strategy management we got the book and we put all of our processes in place and we started running. And to steal a line from one of our task force members, Savan, and own the lightning rod, in some cases, we were seen as a bit of bulldozing change through the organization. So we took a step back and we realized that, in dealing with the personalities, we really need to understand how to convey change in our organization. How to convey to our leadership, okay, this is the change that we want to spread across the service, and then how to speak to the individual members about how does this change affect you. But what we heard was there's a strong appetite for change, so much so that people were saying in certain cases, okay, why aren't we doing this already? We needed to do this yesterday, so let's just get on with it. And then in cases they were saying, and I'll use the new divisional boundaries as an example. People were saying, okay, well, let's just get it right. So some cases you might need to slow down a little bit, and because we need to get this really, really right. And I think that's a good thing, because what we also saw was when there was a lack of communication and a lack of engagement, there were gaps, and those gaps were filled in with rumors as well as locally driven initiatives. And in some cases, we had to say, okay, this is a great initiative, but maybe you have to slow down a little bit because the end state, it might conflict with the end state vision that we want. But again, we see that as an extremely positive thing, because throughout our entire service, there is a great appetite for change. When I speak about process, I always think about moving. When we move from a house to another house, we always take care of the big things. We always make sure we have people ready to move the fridge and the stove and the furniture, but we always forget about the little things. And we really needed to take a step back and say, like Charlene mentioned, the people, process, technology. What are the individual steps that are required to be covered in order to be successful? Because we can bulldoze things, or we can take our time and get it right. So by having Charlene and other experts come in and really show us a proper governance in terms of pulling all of this off has been refreshing and beneficial to our process.
So the other piece I wanted to build on is Greg spoke a little bit about engagement and member buy-in. So that's been another, I'm going to say, area of challenge or area of learning for us. And so, practically thinking or common sense will tell us the importance of leadership engagement, leadership alignment, and the member buy-in from the front line. What's different in this environment is with a command and control structure or the rank structure that's so deeply woven into the everyday operations of the entire organization, the fundamental concepts of this rank structure conflict in some ways with the general principles of engagement and buy-in. So sort of trying to grapple and understand when do you use that formal authority versus when do you spend the time to incentivize and to bring people along has been something that we've had to work through as a team and continue to work through, because there's often that temptation to sort of bulldoze and just do it versus understanding when it's important to bring people along, and even when there's resistance, to take the time to bring those resistors on board. On a somewhat similar note, I'd say gaining consensus has also been an area of learning in terms of, it's ideal to often get consensus across the board when you're moving forward and build in that confidence. But sometimes you don't have that luxury of getting consensus from everybody. And it's about understanding when you've got that critical mass, or when you've got at least the right select few that are willing to come on board and move forward with that few or with that critical mass and bring those resistors on board over the course of the way. The other area of learning, I spoke about the team composition and the internal and external expertise. So the other piece is that as important as it is to have people who understand the business leading the change, complementing that structure with the right expertise in terms of, not just project management, but really understanding organizational change or things like process redesign. It's important to have that good balance of that expertise combined with business knowledge in order to get that sweet spot and really achieve success. And then finally, I'd say a focus on outcomes and not outputs. Again, in this organization, there's such a high level of, there's such a strong appetite for change and a willingness to do things and to get things done. And it's important that we build in those structures at the onset and take the time to do the planning and the due diligence so that the quality of what's being delivered is something that is meaningful and valuable and that will last versus just getting it done and being able to check it off of a list. Okay. I'll then, sorry, it's still me. So then I'll then move on to our next steps, or what we call focus on the road ahead. So over the last several months, we've gotten very strong support across the leadership team in the organization and really wanting to build on that leadership strength and tap into it to help work collaboratively as an organization. So I spoke a little bit about developing these executive steering committees and really tapping into the senior management layer to help collectively execute on some of these changes, because we're a relatively small team when you consider sort of the magnitude and complexity of this strategy, and so it's important to tap into the other resources, especially those leadership pieces, in order to move forward as a collective whole. The other area of focus is around change management. So again, tapping into the expertise of the board's change management advisor, Jim Rankin, our next area of focus will be to develop project-specific change management plans. And so we'll be doing that over the course of the next few months and really looking at how to better manage and support the stakeholders as we move forward. And finally, from my end, resourcing is another focus area for me. So taking a sort of step back and looking at what we've accomplished and what's still left, and again, talking about that balance of the right internal versus external expertise and where are the right supports needed in order to achieve the successes and keep up the momentum that we've had so far.
Other areas of real focus for us will be individual initiatives such as the Neighborhood Officer Initiative. We have a strong partnership with Deputy Ewan and his team at DPSU with Inspector Ridzik to figure out what the framework of that will look like in the future. Going back to our partnerships with the city, a member of the Community Safety and Wellbeing team has been embedded with us to build that program. Scott McKean and his Community Crisis Response Program, their folks are committed to neighborhoods. They know what's going on in neighborhoods, so what better partner to build a neighborhood officer program with. So that's another breakthrough and focus for us moving forward. Charlene talked earlier about the divisional boundaries, and our reality is that it is just at this stage lines on a map. To operationalize that touches every aspect of our service, from every frontline officer to every member in administrative support functions to every investigator that we have. It touches every aspect. So we need to make sure that there's no stone unturned in terms of process and people and technology. We also will be embarking on community engagement about these new boundaries, engaging our politicians, engaging our community members, and as well as our internal members as well. I specifically didn't talk about court services and parking enforcement when I mentioned service reallocation. Through the city, Ernst & Young will be delivering their cost-benefit analysis to us in May. It'll come to the chief, it'll come to the board. We're excited to get that report to see what it entails and to move forward with the next iteration of what we can do. In the meantime, we've been meeting with our members from courts and parking to talk about how we can embed those two important units into the daily operations of our policing units. Lastly, I will talk about something that we need to celebrate and really focus on moving forward is what is the FIX, the Police Hub for Innovation Exchange. Sergeant Elise Higgett, now Staff Sergeant Elise Higgett, has moved on, has been promoted. Congratulations to her. We have just staffed the unit with two more individuals, Sergeant Christy Smith and Mary Shapiro. and they have picked up the ball and run with it. We are looking to embed the fix into what is the daily operations of policing, so that we can constantly be soliciting innovation and ideas from members throughout our entire service. We have hundreds of initiatives and ideas currently on the go, and it's our job to see what are net new, what are the initiatives that kind of already fit in with what's the work that's already happening. And it's an interesting process. With regards to engagement, we are committed to continuing the engagement with our members, but we're committed to not just make it be a situation where we're talking to people and we're telling people stuff. Today, actually, this afternoon is our last staff sergeant engagement session. We have spoken to all of our staff sergeants, but it's not, we're committing to them to bring them back, to get them involved into the weeds. So it's not just, like I said, us standing in front of you saying, this is what we're going to do. We'd rather say, this is what we want to do, and we want to get your involvement, get your input, to get your hands dirty, and to help us figure out all these different steps of implementation. So that concludes our update, pending any questions.
Thank you very much for a very fulsome update. There are two deputations. One is a written one by Mr. Fredette, which is attached, colleagues, to your... Oh, is he? Okay. Then as Mr. Fredette, perhaps Charlene and Greg, you'd step aside, but stay close, and we'll have Mr. Fredette come up. First of all, Mr. Fredette, thank you very much for coming, and thank you for your written deputation. But we'll give you 5 minutes, and I'll give you a 1 minute warning just as you get close, okay?
Righto.
Thanks so much.
That's why I submitted it in writing, so I won't read it all, but I have some side notes. For full disclosure, I'm a member of 51 Division's Community Police Liaison Committee. So I have interest in it, and I have enough background to discuss this topic, but I do not represent them today. So that's my disclosure. As we can see that, we have a full year under our belt, and I've attended the police college seminar, and I'm fully versed in it, and I've read all the quarterly reports that have been submitted to date. They are highly technical and administrative, but I do wish them to continue, including a presentation like you received today. But I'm also requesting a snapshot of the practical day-to-day effects on the new districts, the current divisions at that level. Initially, last year, you approved 3 divisions, and that would remain standalone, 14, 51, and 52. That might change from what we heard just a few minutes ago, and the others would be collapsed into districts. For years 2 and 4 of the implementation, you want to remain nimble. If you realize that recommendations X, Y, or Z are having unintended consequences, you want to be able to tweak them mid-course. As an example, you as a board started off with a hiring freeze. With evidence-based facts of resignations, retirement, staffing, you suspended the hiring freeze. This was on the citywide level. You should also be monitoring these types of effects at the district level. Look at it as a canary in the coal mine. There is a list that in my submission, the types of information that we could use on a day-to-day basis. As a CPLC, and also for the police staff at the division level, we don't have the resources nor the authority, you do at this table, to divert resources to this type of study. And we see that there was a lot of public consultation at the front end in 2 years back and prior to the implementation, but you've been kind of deaf and silent since. In that we did receive the task force members at a meeting in early January, And we were complimented that we were the only CPLC that showed any interest. Well, we didn't take it as a compliment. We took it as alarm. How come the other divisions are not participating or being sought out and getting that information sought out? Because we are the representatives of the civilians at the local level. You are at this level. And we don't want to get caught in the dynamics between management and the association. We want evidence, facts that would help our decisions. So my only recommendation that I'm putting forth is that one standalone and one merged district be identified for closer study for the practical day-to-day effects of the restructuring program. In that we heard just a few minutes ago that 51 Division got was the first to be sort of like a model test case for the issue of smartphones. And well, why was it coming to us? First of all, we welcome it, but what's it going to do at 51 Division? And how are we going to get reports? We heard that there's going to be monitoring, but that would be something handy. As one example, there's all kinds of examples of well, if we don't have the police in the schools anymore, and if we don't have the guns and gangs group anymore, all those full-time equivalencies, where are they being distributed and in what manner? Those are important types of statistics and information that would help us at the local level. It's important at this table, but we would need it tailor-made and isolated per district or division. Thank you.
Ray, thank you very much. Colleagues, questions?
Yes, so I'm just trying to square, your CPLC has had a particular interest in the transformation, but so are you saying that when the CPLC meets, there isn't an ongoing sort of quick update? You're not really being updated on what transformation means on the ground in your area?
Well, we're getting anecdotal and occasional updates from the superintendent. Don't get me wrong. There's good communications there, but they are limited in the effect. In that one answer I received from them was that as far as the level, the impact of staffing levels at the reassignment of officers, civilization positions, attrition numbers, projections, that data is more elusive as it is a work in progress.
Right.
So that gives us no answer. Another part of my answer to you is in recommendation 17 of the way forward, it deals with transparency and involvement of the public. Well, right now, it's still up for grabs. It doesn't say anything of what the plans are. So that's what I meant a few minutes ago, that we seem to be blind.
Right. Okay. Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Thank you so much.
Colleague, Marie?
Thank you for taking the time to come here today and for participating in the CPLC. I can see that you are one of the more active members, and I know you're not wearing that hat today. You have actually given us information that was part of a question I was going to ask the service who are going to come back and take questions. So you identified some benchmarking areas, and my question was going to be, and I'll ask it now, if 51 Division is the guinea pig, for want of a better word, for the connected officer, how can we know how things have changed? And I think I hear you asking a similar type of question with some very specific deliveries. Is there one area, and I know you've got a number here, that would be at the local level particularly relevant to your CPLC that we might want to track? And I'm assuming that we are setting benchmarks, so I'll look forward to hearing that from the service side.
Well, sure. We would need a base line, either 2016 before we started the implementation process or the end of year one. We need a baseline and then measure from there in that how many officers were reassigned, reallocated to bike duty. or to foot patrol, or in different types of shifts. That's important to know.
So I would call that deployment. So you would be interested in looking at how there's been redeployment of officers as an example of a benchmark.
That's right. It's not our job to deploy. I know that role belongs to management, but we want to be informed.
Okay, no more questions, colleagues?
Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Let me just pause for a minute and remind visitors to the meeting that the rules of the meeting forbid people to put up signs or placards during the meeting. So I'd ask them please to take those down, or we'll suspend the meeting and remove the signs. Take it down, please. Thank you. There's one more deputation, and that is Derek Moran. Derek, are you here? Okay. If not, Greg and Charlene, we just come back, and if you've got colleagues will have questions, but also perhaps you could address Mr. Fredette's comments as well, if you have got an answer to that. But let me ask colleagues if you've got questions of. Okay.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Well,
don't,
maybe
don't
I'll
miss
ask
the
that you
chance.
can sort of frame the answer. I'm interested in hearing what that plan is, the communications out to CPLCs and such, because it seems to me if you're, helping them craft, here's what it means to us in our area, CPLCs regularly, it would meet the community requirement that they ought to be constantly updated on it. But it sounds like they're not really getting anything from the center of the strategy to help them craft that communication out. Is that in the plan?
I think that there's a couple of levels to the answer. I think that as we spoke about earlier, everything that we're doing is rooted in project management. So we have a strong level of business cases, logic models, evaluation frameworks to make sure that we do have a baseline and that we can kind of track what our progress is. When it comes to the communication and engagement, we have spent a lot of the time in the last year, like Charlene kind of talked about, is building what that is, building that foundation. And now that we are at the stage where we're actively ready to start implementing tangible things, like I talked about in the focus on the road ahead, part of that focus is to really ramp up the engagement internally and externally. We, like I also talked about, we have a strong partnership with our DPSU unit, and which talks about the CPLCs. And like Mr. Fredette mentioned, there was a strong focus early on about getting as much information out there as possible to the CPLCs. But to be honest with you, it was extremely refreshing to be able to go down to 51 and have a meeting with Mr. Fredette and his colleagues at the CPLC there.
So if I can follow up, are they being contemplated that even, it doesn't sound like they are, it sounds like it's just sort of driven by when the change happens. But so for instance, well, I'm just going to have to speak very frankly, or the question's going to seem like I'm going around in circles. When we have this communication campaign out there going against us on the part of association leadership saying policing's falling apart, and responses disappeared, and there's no one in your neighborhood, and that is being said to people. I had the association visit my town hall to tell people that there were no cops in their neighborhood. It seems to me that the most effective vehicle would be to make sure that in those communities where you have that kind of anti-information campaign, if that's not true, there should be a sense of urgency to communicating what is the plan. While there is a change going on here, while this division is now paired with another, et cetera, indeed there is response going on. It's happening in a different form. And if those senior officers in that division have to deliver the message, they have to speak the truth, and in so doing get used to standing with the change. Is there a plan to make sure that is what happens over time, that they begin to be the best and most local grassroots response to a bad information campaign.
Yeah, I just want to be clear and accurate and stay focused on the initial question, which was, once the report was put out, the communication piece was something that was necessary in order for us to be successful. And as we've progressed, I know that especially from strategic management, and thank you very much for all the work that they have done. I think we overlook the amount of work that has actually been done, which is amazing. But the communications plan was put out there. Access to information was readily available. We've had meetings from the senior management level to staff sergeant level, which is being recently addressed. And we've had always the ability to have that open door concept for anyone that wasn't sure, needed clarity. There was always a mechanism for reaching points for that. But I think in the go forward, what we have learned, because we have noticed that there is some sort of a gap, so what we have learned now is the communication piece has changed. And with that change now, it's investing in ensuring that the message is out there by having a return to the table conversation. So now it's just a matter of sharing the information, but giving tasks and responsibilities, and then saying, come back with these answers, come back with the feedback, because before that was a piece that wasn't necessarily communicated. Some got it and did, but I don't think the vast majority did. So now we're creating those tasks and responsibilities so that there is that opportunity to measure that, yes, the message is received, it is put out there, and here is the feedback that you're getting as a result of the message that we've delivered. So that's the next step, and it will help a lot more now because we are at the implementation stage. So tangible things are rolling out and are happening and are causing conversations to take place, which makes it an easier process from the grassroots up to management to have that communication because they've got something tangible to talk about and discuss.
Any other questions, colleagues? Ken?
Yeah, you've talked a lot about the internal dynamics of what was being done here. In terms of communication, following up a little bit on the communication, what is first of all, your general assessment of how the messaging is getting across to the rank and file?
So that the message is being received, and it's being received well. To go back to what that lesson learned was, I think that what we've had to do is to adapt our message depending on who our audience is. If we're talking to staff sergeants, for example, we're telling them, okay, this is what the vision of the service is. We need, and with a strong ask to them, to continue the conversation amongst their members.
Yeah, well, sometimes we do get some messaging in the public that the rank and file is not always embracing what is being communicated. In fact, there has been some, you mentioned the resistors. What is the basis of the resistance that you experience?
Yeah, I think the reality is that there is more communication that we can be doing, but I think just as the chief and Greg spoke about, I think what we've learned is that sometimes it's not enough for us to disseminate information to certain stakeholder groups and just have this expectation that they're going to disseminate it down to their own teams and their own staffs, that we have to take that extra measure of making sure we're asking them to disseminate it down and even tracking and measuring in some cases that it's actually been done. So I think, the amount of levels and layers that require communication with these types of initiatives is immense, and so that there's more that we need to do other than just simply giving updates. It's about tracking and measuring as well.
Well, the second part of my question is around the external communication, where in the task force, we talked a lot about every 3 months, the neighborhoods would sometimes have an opportunity to evaluate the effectiveness of the change or changes. How is that factoring into all of this?
So like the chief had mentioned, all of the initiatives have a communication aspect to it and an engagement aspect to it. With regards to the neighborhood officer program specifically, there has been community engagement done. There's been a lot of research being taken place, and our next steps for that is to ramp that up in terms of the design of it, and then getting input from the members of the communities, as well as not only getting their input on structure, but even with regards to design. We've put a lot of time and effort into developing materials for officers by getting input from a whole bunch of people, crime prevention stuff, all kinds of stuff.
So the community is not yet evaluating the effectiveness of this. Would that be?
So I think it depends on what you're asking. The effectiveness of
the changes according to the recommendations, of course, right? I'm trying to get a sense of what feedback or what responses you're getting from reactions from the community around this. Are they noticing a change? Because I've heard mixed messages about that, and so I just wanted to get your view on that.
Well, definitely the scorecard that is released as a public scorecard that's available to every member of the public. Anecdotally, I can't say that our phone is ringing off the hook with people, saying, "Oh, I'd like to comment on the scorecard." But again, also anecdotally, we have been hearing that the community is appreciative of that information because again, it's something that really the service hasn't typically done.
Yeah, because some of the communities are certainly that I've been speaking to, they're not even aware of this, right? And so that concerns me immensely, because as community engagement was one of the major objectives of the TTF recommendations as well. So, what are the next steps in terms of making that a reality, more of a reality?
Sure, and so I do want to mention that for some of our initiatives, we have been engaging very actively external community groups. So for instance, with the organizational culture assessment, we held a series of virtual town halls where, the message was through social media, communicated and informing folks of the different times and available time slots to be able to participate in these virtual town halls. We also held focus groups with inside of various community groups as well. So there's a number of efforts underway to engage the community, even at early stages in the initiatives, even if we haven't yet reached a point of evaluating and implementing something, just at those early design phases or to solicit feedback wherever we can.
And just to echo to that, with regards to the town hall that was held recently, there's 15,000 members of the community participated, stayed at the table, over 5,000 contributed. So is there room for improvement? Yes, there is, but I just want to be clear that there have been very overt actions taken by the service to make sure that the message is there. And you're right, the commitment to get community involved and keeping them up to speed with what needs to be discussed on the modernization plan.
And just to echo what the chief said, I think we fully recognize that there is more we could be doing to communicate, and sometimes it's just, a matter of resourcing challenges and where to focus our efforts. But we fully have that on our radar and continue to strive to meet the communication needs and stakeholder needs across all of the initiatives.
And my final question is that would you not consider working in partnership with some of the local agencies that are dealing on an ongoing basis with communities, and also utilizing some of the skills, the professional skills of community engagers, so to speak, with the city and the province, both the city and the province? Would that not be a consideration?
Short answer, yes. Absolutely, and I think that we've already leveraged. I'll use Jesse Singh as an example from the Community Crisis Response Program. He was instrumental in helping us develop what that external engagement plan for the cultural assessment looked like. And now that he's been brought on board to help us develop the Neighborhood Officer Program with Deputy Ewan and DPSU, that commitment remains to, like Charlene said, engage with the community as much as possible.
Particularly the marginalized communities.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you, colleagues. If there are no further questions, Greg and Charmaine, let me thank you for all the work that you've done, but also let me echo Chief Saunders and thank you for the work that the members of the implementation team are doing. Please pass that on to Staff Superintendent Bergen, but it's tough. We're in the middle of implementation sometimes to see it fully, and I know an extraordinary amount of work is being done, and things like the 51 Division are very exciting. The rollout of the Connected Officer Program, which will eventually be right across and transform the service in so many ways. I would just encourage, as our deputy said, and as our number of our colleagues, just to make sure we're going above and beyond in the communications, because as things go forward, not everybody's focused on it, and the more we can communicate, the better. So thank you very much for your presentation. Councillor Lee, something you wish to add?
Yes, I just, no questions, but I just want to make a comment that, you know, during a time of transformation and organizational changes, communications is very important. I mean, in my area, I am in close contact with many of my with my own CPLC, and I've had conversations with Deputy Ewan and also Deputy Coxon, and they expressed a lot of uncertainty to me. And so I brought Deputy Coxon out to one of my town halls, and she did get feedback from many of the people, because in these times of changes, when you're in the East Division, we are going from 9 divisions to 5 districts. So it is big changes coming. So the people that liaise as part of the community liaising are uncertain, so they don't really know what to tell their own communities. So that is why we need to keep those communication lines open. And I understand that, you know, not only internally, I've always said that transformation is also the clients that we are serving out there. We've got to ensure that we also have them coming along as well. Because if they're expecting the same kind of the way that's been done all along, it's not going to be. I mean, I've really put in my newsletters that you can report things online now, and many of them will say they're very surprised. And on your smartphone, you can, you know, report things, you know. So, and you know, when 20% of people read what I put out, the other 80% doesn't know anything about it. Okay, so you've got to keep reaching out until you get at least to 50%.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, and
Thank you.
Charlene and Greg, thank you very much for your presentation. Colleagues, got a motion to receive the report and the deputations. Ms. Mulliner, seconded. Ms. Chandrasera, all in favor? Any contrary? Carried. Thank you. Item number 6 is a very important item, the independent external review into systemic concerns relating to missing persons investigation. Mayor Tory, this is your motion, so maybe I'll turn to you and ask you to kick it off.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. And what I'll do is just make a few introductory comments, and then we'll put the motion up and just go through that so that people understand. It's been distributed with the agenda materials, and I think it's been fairly widely reviewed over the last week or so. I think, as people know, but I think it's worth remembering that there have been cases going back some considerable period of time, well before even the present troubling series of events that involve the disappearance of individuals, including members of our LGBTQ communities. And that has created over time a series of very troubling questions. And so, you know, out of, I guess, a sense of humanity and sensitivity to and fairness to the family and friends of those people, but I think as importantly, in order to sort of make sure we can do our job of maintaining trust and confidence in policing and in the sort of overall system that protects the public interest. This is one of those times in the public domain, and they arise all the time in the public domain, quite properly so, when an independent external review is necessary to maintain and in some cases to renew trust and confidence. It's just one of those opportunities that arises, and one of those times when it is appropriate and necessary to have somebody dispassionately answer what are often very difficult, complicated questions, but somebody other than the group that the questions are being asked about. This board, in fact, exists here for that very purpose, to oversee what is a very difficult task that our police have, police in whom are invested very significant special authorities and who have a very complicated job to do. So the genesis of today's motion goes back, I guess, to a series of tragic and horrific events which have deeply affected all of us in Toronto, but including especially members of the LGBTQ and the church and Wellesley communities, to name two different sets of communities that have been particularly deeply affected by this. But I think it's had an impact on many people, all people across the city. If you go back, the first thing that was done, and quite properly so by the Chief of Police, was that he initiated an internal review. And that is something that is quite properly something he would do and does often on different kinds of things. And the only thing that we have requested with his full support subsequent to that at the February meeting of this board was to ensure that the results of that public review, subject to legal and other considerations that may prevent parts of it from being made public right away, is to have that review report, when it's available, made public so that the public can see what came out of that review. Chief Saunders began at much the same time as that to explore with the appropriate government authorities what could be done by way of a public inquiry into the particular cases that are now being investigated and will end up, I'm sure, in the judicial process at some point in time, just to explore something that I'll come back to as a very important point in all of this, which is that we have, as well as a responsibility to oversee, we have, as the body that is going to initiate, I hope, subject to the approval of colleagues today, this independent external review, an absolutely overriding responsibility as well to protect the integrity of the ongoing investigations and to protect the integrity of judicial proceedings that will flow from those investigations, so as to ensure that that can unfold in a way that can be not be affected by things going on elsewhere. And so the next step seemed to be, and this has had, I should emphasize throughout, the full support of the Chief of the Police, because he recognized the need for an external independent review early on, but also had that same responsibility, which is our collective responsibility, to make sure that nothing any of us did was going to jeopardize those investigations or those judicial proceedings. It doesn't mean that all the difficult questions don't get asked and answered, but it does speak to the question of when they might get answered, and to some extent how they get answered. And that is probably where ultimately some other kind of inquiry will come in to play as well. Subsequent to the February meeting of the board, when we did ask that the independent review report be made public, I think it is fair to say that the list of unanswered and very troubling questions that have caused a lot of anxiety in the community has grown longer. And so I think what motivated me to put this motion forward, again, I would say with full support of the board chair and the chief, has been to see what we could move forward with now in order to begin the question of answering some of those difficult questions, or just looking at ways in which we could do things better, so as to get some of that advice and have some of that learning as quickly as possible. So the way that we've tried to go about doing it, in terms of at least the motion that's being put here today for consideration by the board, is to ask the chair of the board to report to the April 2018 meeting on the composition of a working group. And some people may say, well, why don't you just get on with it? Why are you going to talk about a working group? Well, it's because the message that certainly I've received loud and clear, and I think my colleagues have as well, and others in public office who have a lot of opportunity to interact with people in the communities that I made reference to, understand that there is a deep desire not only to see some of the difficult questions answered, but to be consulted on how we go about doing that. And so we've chosen to spend the next month taking a look at the composition of a working group that will advise us, the Independent Oversight Board, on the composition and structure of the internal review, external review, or reviews, because it could be that it's recommended that there be more than one. And we've said in the motion, which is up there now or soon will be, that it should consist, at least the motion says this, of not more than 4 members, including a member of the board, as well as 3 external members. And again, we wanted to make sure that we gave the communities that are most concerned about this, all of the community, an opportunity to help us to identify the 3 external members. And so the chair is asked by the motion to consult the community, and in particular to consult groups that may feel that when it comes to the examination of missing persons investigations and some things that I'll get into in the second part of the motion, feel that most that have the greatest level of concern about this, that they should be consulted on both the nature of the reviews and on the composition of this working group. And that includes groups that are set out here, organizations which work with sex workers, harm reduction and homeless populations, groups representing Indigenous people and the LGBTQ communities, including the Alliance for South Asian AIDS Prevention. And we have added to this something that will not have been seen in the first iteration of the motion that was made public a few days ago, which is that we think it will be very helpful in order to properly and effectively and completely achieve that consultative goal, given that the members of the working group, will need some assistance with this, that we can obtain and will obtain a facilitator to help with this task to make sure that this consultative phase is carried out effectively and completely. The second part you see right here, and there is one more change that I just draw your attention to from the originally circulated motion, is that the working group, once constituted, will then report to the Toronto Police Services Board at the June meeting, and that's moved it forward 1 month from May, simply to be realistic about saying, well, if you're going to meaningfully consult, if you're going to have the help of a facilitator, and you're going to put the group together and get it to do some of its work, in an effective manner and without being sort of rushed, that providing that period of time is something that is important. And so if you then look at under that item 2, I'll just briefly run through the parts of it. What it's meant to do, the motion, is to ask this working group to report to the board on first part A there, the identification of the best possible form of an external review or reviews, including one commissioned by the board, for example, and or one that was conducted by an existing third party, such as the Ontario Independent Police Review Director, OIPRD. And so it gives the committee the option of looking at those different kinds of combinations or a single kind of review and giving their advice with respect to what they thought would be the most effective in the circumstances. And the circumstances really are presented by Part B. And it would then, Part B would then have the working group also discuss the possible terms of reference and make recommendations to the board in that regard, and would include the 4 things that are listed. First, Toronto Police Services practices and actions relating to past missing persons investigations, subject to any legal restrictions. And I'm going to emphasize some of these words that are in here because I think they're important in order to make sure that people understand the duty that all of us have and the restraints that will place on the first phase of this work. Second, Toronto Police Service Board policies, Toronto Police Service procedures, protocols, training, organizational structures relating to missing persons investigations. And then again, words that I'll draw your attention to, which will not include information or discussion of the MacArthur investigation and possible trial proceedings. And I understand the fact, and I think most people that I've talked to in the community, and as I've had various formal meetings, I've had a dozen groups into my office together with Councillor Wong Tam to discuss the deeply held concerns that exist about this in the community, that that is meant only to say that at this point in time, as we can begin the work at looking at some of the systemic issues related to missing persons investigations, we have to take great care in what we do and don't do in order to preserve the integrity of the investigations and the judicial proceedings. And so that's why those words are there, as are the words up at the top about this being subject to any legal restrictions. And to some extent, the burden of this will fall more on the person or organization that is ultimately chosen as a result of this process to conduct this external third-party review, to assess the proper timing of when questions are asked and answered, more so than on the board or even on this committee. The third thing that I think is very important that we looked at here, and I've heard this in my own meetings with the communities and when I've been out in the community in recent weeks and months, any systemic concerns, especially those which relate to bias against people based on protected grounds outlined in the Ontario Human Rights Code. And that's as relates to missing persons investigations and policies and procedures and actions undertaken in respect to those. And then finally, a point that often I think we put into these sorts of things, but I think we underestimate the importance of it, which is the learning that we can take from people who do things well elsewhere. Because we think we do things pretty well in Toronto, and I guess we do in many respects, but there's always somebody who has a better idea that they've implemented as a result of some experiences of their own. And so this group would be asked to advise us on the inclusion in the terms of reference of a consideration of national and international best practices into missing persons investigations. I should say again, I think you will all have read the Chief's letter, which accompanies my own, and he may speak to this himself, which indicates there are some steps he's already taken inside the police organization, as is his responsibility as Chief to consider some changes that are made to how missing persons investigations are handled. But this investigation is meant to look at this external independent review is meant to look at nonetheless at how things are done elsewhere. And then finally, just something that would be the proper domain of such a working group, which is to have a look at the anticipated costs of the review and timelines, and make recommendations to this board in that regard. So that is the motion, Mr. Chair, and I will simply conclude by saying that I think, yes, we have an obligation here to work with the police service to make sure people are safe. We have an obligation to oversee what the police are doing, but most of all, I think our most important single responsibility is to make sure that we do our very best as a board, distinct from the police service and in a position of oversight, to maintain trust and confidence in policing. And I think this beginning, and it is just a beginning, but it's a beginning that I think is as far as we can go at this stage, but nonetheless a very important, very significant first step to look at some things that have been lingering for some considerable period of time and that need addressing by an outside independent reviewer. And this will begin that process with, I guess, some decisions to be made in the June meeting about exactly then how that review will happen. But we'll be taking the time between now and June to consult the community, which I think is also very important, and to try to do this in a very thoughtful way, commensurate with the importance of the issue to large segments of the community.
Thank you, Mayor Tory. And there are a number of deputations, but before we get to that, Chief Saunders, is there any comments you wish to make for your submission?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first and foremost, I want to say that I support the motion brought forward by Mayor Tory. I believe the public interest and the best interest of the Toronto Police Service will be well served by an independent external review to report publicly on issues related to missing persons. For Toronto's LGBTQ community, this has been a very difficult time, and I know that many are very upset and many are still grieving, and they have many questions about what happened and what could have been done differently. I take these questions seriously, and I hope that my actions demonstrate that conviction. So far, I've taken a number of steps in responding, including to, as you have addressed, Mr. Mayor, ordering the professional standards to review in the cases of Tess Ritchie and Laura Wells. Second, I've had Deputy Chief Barb McLean and LGBTQ Liaison Officer Danielle Botno. They've been reaching out in the community, as have I, meeting with groups and taking the time to listen more carefully. And I have also initiated plans to create a dedicated missing persons unit within the Toronto Police Service. And its mandate will be to review all outstanding cases and consider whether our existing procedures and training are appropriate and effective. I'd finally like to reassure the board that it has the support and active participation of the command team as well as the Toronto Police Service as we move forward with this review.
Thank you, Chief Saunders. As I said, there are a number of deputations. The first one, Brian Demetos. Brian, you know the rule, 5 minutes, I'll give you a 1 minute warning. Yep. Yep.
To speak on the item missing and murdered members of the LGBTQI communities. Before I get in the heart of the review, I need to point out 3 extremely problematic issues regarding the agenda item from members of this board. I am very angered, full of rage and sadness for not only losing friends, but how they were lost and how they continue to be victimized time and time again, even in their deaths. One by our own chief, who had the need to take a public relations stance and and victim blame not only the LGBT community as a whole, but victims of rape and physical assault themselves, blaming us for not coming forward, and for the mayor to support this victim blaming, so the police can look innocent in all this. You are not innocent in any of this. Irrelevant on what you meant It was, as it always should be, about addressing the impact of your own words and actions, not your intent. This is what should have happened but did not. Yet again, another dire reminder of how folks in power and police avoid accountability to community and my friends. So I say this, shame on you both. Now, how my communities are dead but still being victimized in the hands of the police include friends like Dean Lewiska, who you, as police, had the disgusting procedure not to release his mugshot as if him, the victim, was the criminal. How dare you? Why did you not ask his friends or family for a respectable picture of him? Imagine his family having to open the newspaper to find this out. Just imagine that. I say in anger and rage and sadness, shame on you. Now, the third point I need to make in regards to the pattern of brutality my community and friends must continue to endure by members of this board is again from John Tory, to use the LGBT community ideas and policies and advocacy around police accountability to make his own words take full credit in the media and even on this agenda. Yes, you did give us a small paragraph in the end and submitted a letter that recognized us. Thank you for that small print, but again I say sadness and rage, shame on you, Mayor Tory. Now on the purpose of this agenda item, there has been a clear, as it always been, in the police force, a dangerous and deadly lack of cultural competence of my communities, the LGBTQI communities, in police policy and everyday standard operating procedure that, in no doubt in my mind, contribute daily to the historical and present transphobic brutality we face from Toronto Police Services. There is extreme amounts of change that needs to happen regarding the case of Project Houston, to the McCarthy cases, to the policies and procedures that kill many members of my community. This review, if it has any chance of delivering meaningful results, it must expand more than just the case of missing persons, but how police force treat folks who are queer, trans, and two-spirited, who are also racialized, homeless, in sex work, those with substance use, and impacted by mental health, because all that does impact my community. This should and must include policy and procedure on how police treat trans folks every day. The common officer and most of all the members of this board cannot tell the difference or even know the definitions and or difference between transgender, transsexual, intersex, two-spirited, non-binary, genderqueer. Should we? The procedure and policy for police is that when an officer arrests one of my community members who identifies under a different identity than cisgender, it is up to the individual police officer to determine what jail they should go to. On average, they get it wrong because their training and their manual is wrong. And to make matters worse, the only option police folks have on protecting, quote unquote, non-cisgender members of our community is to put them in solitary confinement. Even when they're put on the wrong jail or the right jail, but are attacked for being non-cisgendered, this is written in the police training manual. Again, we see systematic transphobia that my community must endure. That is cruel, it is disgusting, it is punishment while being punished just for being who you are. Oh, how my community knows that experience. For this review to work, you must go beyond the regular practices that reviews have with regards to misconduct of the TPS. You must examine everyday brutality that is practiced by the Toronto Police Force. You must add not only members of the government, but extensive outreach and participation from members of my community. And I'm not just talking about the rich, white, cis gays you hire and tokenize to pinkwash your way out of bloody hands. I'm talking about getting LGBT folks who have lived experiences in jail system and police brutality. I'm also talking about members of my community who are queer and trans people of color who have lived experience of mental health and addiction and sex work. This review will mean nothing unless we incorporate the principles of intersectionality in how we deal with the most diverse community in the world. I repeat this again, no change will happen until the most vulnerable and marginalized members of my community have our voices centered here, centered in the review, and voices centered in training of officers, the manual and policies of Toronto Police. Until that step has been taken, all you're doing is pinkwashing excuses to justify your brutality to vulnerable populations.
Thank you, Brian.
Am I out of time?
Yes, you were. Sorry, I was holding up a minute ago the one finger. Colleagues, questions, Shelley?
Yes, thanks, Brian. So, Brian, I don't know if you came seeing the content of the motion.
I did.
So Mayor Tory has added, I think a lot of people in the community had the idea that it was just going to be about looking at missing persons procedures, but Mayor Tory has now added, and any systemic concerns, especially those related to bias against people on protected grounds. So within that clause, if what we get back in June is that this inquiry is going to leave a lot of room to explore that, will that help us deal with the issues that you've presented today?
No, because historically you chose members who are usually compliant with the police, usually white cis folks or folks that are privileged in our community. What I'm saying, for this to work, you have to outreach to folks that are not regularly seen, not the regular folks that are usually going to be up here speaking, not the regular folks that have that privilege. You need to outreach to the most marginalized within my community, folks impoverished, folks, racialized folks, trans folks, two-spirited folks, folks that are most impacted by the brutality of police. This is just not going to work. It's just going to be pinkwashing. It's just going to be tokenizing its way out of to a good PR campaign. You must consult all community members, not the ones that Kristen Wong-Tam comes up here with, but folks that are not regularly asked. Those voices need to be centered, or else this is just going to be another...
We have to add that in, is what you're saying.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
Colleagues, any other questions? Brian, thank you. Next is... Next, could you put that down, please? Next, Shakir Rahim and Mr. Rahim, thank you very much for coming forward. And you've provided us a written deputation, so we thank you for that as well.
My pleasure. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes,
Okay,
let's
great.
stay close to the mic.
Good afternoon. My name is Shakir Rahim, and I'm a board member of the Alliance for South Asian AIDS Prevention, as well as a gay South Asian man who lives with both a mental and physical chronic health condition. Also in attendance today is our Executive Director, Haran Vijayanathan. ASAP is here with the support of 30 diverse community organizations and community leaders. Today I will tell you about our advocacy and positions on the review process. ASAP was founded 29 years ago by a group of activists because HIV-positive South Asians could not locate culturally competent care. We are the only LGBTQ non-governmental organization that specifically serves the South Asian and Middle Eastern communities in Ontario. Our community, and others, have been alarmed about the pattern of disappearances of South Asian, Middle Eastern, and LGBTQ persons. We are alarmed at how long it took for an alleged perpetrator to be arrested. We are alarmed at reports that proper investigative steps may not have been followed. And we are alarmed at the complexity of some of our community members' lives may have led to erroneous conclusions about why they could not be found. And we know that systemic issues, including bias, underlie our concerns. It is bias that is conscious and unconscious, individual and structural. The result of our concerns has been a crisis in public trust between our community and the Toronto Police. A lack of public trust compromises effective policing, participation in the criminal justice system, and most importantly, the safety of the public. In January, to begin the process of rebuilding that trust, we called for external accountability of the Toronto Police and constructive dialogue with them. We have worked hard to deliver both of these objectives since January, working with the mayor and his policy team, and meeting with the leadership of the Toronto Police Service. While we support this motion, we would like to make our position clear on 3 issues. First, our request is, and has always been, for the board to commission the independent review into how the TPS conducts missing person investigations. As the recently passed Safer Ontario Act makes clear, and Mayor Tory, as you made clear in your opening statements here today, the board is responsible for providing adequate and effective policing in its area of policing responsibility. The Morden report into the G20 summit, commissioned by this board, emphasized the importance of the board effectively and actively exercising that oversight function. We support other reviews and inquiries, but they should supplement, not replace, a board-commissioned process. Our second position is that it is essential that the community is involved throughout the entire process of establishing any review. The working group that this motion creates cannot be the end of the community's role, but rather the beginning. The formulation of the final terms of reference for any review must include direct community involvement, and that includes the meetings with the lawyers, with policy staff, and so forth that often characterize the technical details of how these reviews come into being. And that should also include the new addition to this motion of the selection of a facilitator. That facilitator should only be chosen with the full agreement of the working group that this motion strikes. Third, we recognize that the review cannot compromise the investigation of criminal proceedings of Bruce McArthur. Keeping that in mind, however, a systemic review still ought to consider any prior missing person investigations within appropriate legal boundaries. In closing, our hope is that at the end of this process, we are closer to a reality where every member of our public truly feels that their life is treated with the same respect and care as any other. Because today, in this city, that is not the case. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Rahim. Thank you for coming, and thank you for the presentation. Colleagues, questions? Ms. Chandra-Kassar?
Thank you, and thank you for your statement. My question to you is, what is the scope that ASAP would like to see as part of this review?
So our position is that the central purpose of the review is to examine missing person investigations with a focus on the LGBTQ community. But as the prior deputant, I think, rightfully made clear, you cannot answer that question without looking at the broader systemic considerations. And so we expect that to be part of the process. At the same time, what we recognize, and I think what the history of independent reviews has emphasized, including the current ongoing national inquiry into missing Indigenous women, is that a review has to have a certain focus and scope. So absolutely, that would be our approach. But most importantly, the fact that this review is happening does not mean that there should not be other steps taken. I think Kristen Wong-Tam's written deputation spoke about a real history between the police and the community with respect to tension and bias. And so I think this motion is perhaps a starting point about a broader conversation and set of examinations that are necessary.
Any other questions, colleagues? Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Susan Gapka? Thank you, Susan. You know, I'll give you 5 minutes and I'll give you a 1 minute warning.
Okay, I'm going to start my timer. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Susan Gapka, S-U-S-A-N, Gapka, G-A-P-K-A. Oh, yeah, I've been doing that all day. I'm here with the Toronto's Missing Murdered Rainbow community members, and I've been listening to deliberations. In the last couple of weeks, Greg Downer, who started, was looking for his friend. and ended up in this unprecedented series of events where we've got now an alleged serial killer in custody. We've had a lot of violence in our communities. And so they asked me to help out with, we had a media release this morning. We're asking for a public inquiry, and sooner rather than later. We're concerned about the political landscape. We may have the Attorney General is actually the one. So I realize that's out of scope, but that's what kind of got me up at 6 o'clock this morning to talk about. But what I was brought into the group, I think, to help with, not only Greg Downer and other people, is to bring in my relation. I have around diversity, a former homeless kid, just some of the things around some of the disadvantage around some of the people that were found murdered, missing and murdered, and some of that. So, and I realize, so we really want to impress upon you the sense of urgency, but understanding I don't have a vote at this table. So I've actually written a recommendation while I've been listening and learning, because I've learned a lot about this thing that I didn't know a lot about, and I'm here reluctantly today, but this is my own. I just want to remind people I'm an individual. I'm a community member. I worked with the police on and off. I'm a member of the CPLC in 51 Division. That was us who asked about the previous agenda item. I helped form. I was one of the founders of the Chiefs Consultative Committee in 2000, being unaware of the long history between the gay community and our communities, but public policy, I was there. But what I'm seeing here is I'm feeling some of our most disadvantaged people may be left out. Great to see sex workers and homeless people, and I don't know if I saw trans people, but there's a lot of people that are falling through the cracks in a society where there's becoming more and more division between those who have and those who do not, who end up in our parks. So I'm recommending that the Toronto Police Service, in partnership with the City of Toronto City Manager and the soon-to-be constituted LGBTQ2S, I believe, are the advisory committee, to develop a parallel consultation process to develop mechanisms and communications which will work towards improving the public trust and community safety of our rainbow communities and the Toronto Police Service. I feel that there's been moments in time. There was the bathhouse raids, which preceded my coming out experience. There was the Pussy Palace that happened when we were developing the Chiefs Consultative Committee. The G20 experience, which was another schism, and now this. So we have a lot of work to do, and in that regard, around working with the community members who will otherwise be left out of this process. For example, well, not all of us. If you had a badge, you didn't have to undergo security at the front desk. But things like having meetings at police headquarters make a number of us feel uncomfortable. And you haven't seen me here in a while, right? So, better relations in the community. And I'm glad to see that the chief has appointed Deputy Chief Barbara McLean and Danielle to work on those, Botno to work on those relationships. I do have a good working relationship with her. So I think we're almost at time, but we need to do better, and we need this inquiry sooner rather than later. There are questions that we want to see answered, and I think we are building consensus that I think many of us in this room are looking for. What happened? What went wrong? How can we do better next time?
Susan, thank you very much. Colleagues, Councillor Carroll?
Yes, thank you, Susan, as always. But first things first, let's get this out of the way. Do you want to reread your recommendation to me again? I was trying to write it down as fast as possible. You sped up at the end. Just read it out to me
It was
again.
like a 1 minute warning, you know. It's like if I could only do that when I was running a half marathon, I'd be great. Sorry. So,
Yeah, just
so
read it out again.
recommending,
Yeah.
if that's okay with the chair, I can send it to someone. The Toronto Police Service, in partnership with the City of Toronto's city manager and soon to be constituted LGBTQ2S Advisory Committee, develop a parallel consultation process
That was it.
to develop mechanisms and communications which will improve the public trust and community safety between our rainbow communities and the Toronto Police Service. There is so much more I could have written on this, but I realize you have a packed agenda.
Yeah.
And so this is, I think, to enhance those. For me, the feeling is not everyone's going to be part of this process, but a lot of us have a lot of questions. We're a community in grieving, and I think we want to be active and engaged in helping all of us find some answers.
Right. So it would be good if you could email that, because it's a little more, it's longer than I would get written down here, but I think we should look at it. I'm
Thank you.
I'm not sure whether or not it fits today, or it should be transmitted to the steering group that will set up this inquiry and bring the terms back in June. But we can consult with the mayor on that. I just wanted to ask you one other question. You have been away for a while from police board matters, so you may not realize that, in fact, we are discussing this police board meeting, the monthly meeting, moving outside of police headquarters, because it's actually been recommended in other inquiries. We've had that recommendation from Justice Tulloch and others. So there is a move towards getting out of police headquarters. Is this? I think you think strategically. You're very much a policy wonk like me, but is that out there in the community? Is there a lot of talk in the community about they need to get out of that building?
I think there's an emerging discussion about security even at City Hall and in public buildings like this that make a lot of us feel uncomfortable. And if we have broken, I don't know what the word is, I want to find my kind person here. Just a more generous person, but relationships are strained at this time, which makes it even more difficult. When we formed the consultative committee, terms of reference that we would meet in community organizations, that people would be elected at town hall meetings, that the public, there'd be so in the original recommendations in here, which I will leave behind, is that there should be at least a town hall every 6 months. Because we do have a lot to vent, and it will be uncomfortable and ugly, but we need to get that out. Sometimes people will need to get that out before we can start listening to each other, and that's just part of the process of public consultation as well.
Yes, fantastic.
Thank you.
Thanks, Susan.
Thank you, Susan. Ken, you had a question?
Yeah, you mentioned a number of initiatives that have taken place in the past, right? And I'm familiar, I think, with most of them. What would make this this initiative different to get different results? Because obviously they didn't work, and it sounds like it didn't work, right? So with your familiarity and experience with this, are there some things that you want to see that's going to be not the same old?
I think this is an opportunity, actually. This is a traumatic set of circumstances that brings me to go through security downstairs, but brings us here. But if we turn that into an opportunity to have more connections. There is a undercurrent of criminalization, homosexuality, transsexuality. Many of us have been criminalized in the past, so there's that long residual history around that. And so there's some members of our communities who would never think the police can't change. I'm of the view that you can change. I don't quite trust you. I gotta say, I don't quite trust you. I'm a reluctant participant, but we need to, but it's my view that building bridges works much better to having that common communication. There are a lot of people, for whatever reasons, that are not able to come to report, like community-based reporting if you've been violated, if you've been abused, if you feel a crime has been committed of you. And in some of the news that has come out on this investigation, or not maybe the investigation, but in some of the media reports, people have said, there's a serial killer. People have said, I've been attacked, and they were not believed. And that's a tremendous schism that we need to work on doing, improving that public trust on.
Again, Susan, thank you very much for coming here and for your honesty and putting that forward. Thank you.
Thank you
and
for
if
your
you can
time.
get that motion to Ms. Bennett, that would be phenomenal.
Should I, is the secretary?
Yep. Brenda Ross, Brenda, you're next. Do you need some help? Officer, could you help Ms. Ross, please? Thank you.
Thank you. I don't want to sit down.
Okay.
Thank you.
Do you want me to move this over here?
Yes, please, I do. Thank you.
Brenda, thank you for coming. You know the rules, 5 minutes, and I'll give you a 1 minute warning.
Yeah. A couple of days ago, the Toronto Sun printed something that they call a meaning of a term, dumpster fire. This is the meaning that they printed in the newspaper. An utterly calamitous or mismanaged situation or occurrence. And that's what we have. One tragedy after another, and we're still speaking about the same things. Nothing's changed. And thank you to Greg Watt and Miss Charlene, who have just told us something that I wanted to bring up. Cultural Change Report is going to be in at the end of the month. I look forward to seeing it. I can't wait. I believe that cultural change should be pushed right up to the forefront of the way forward. That is part of the problem. Certain people or groups of people are deemed by the police not to be worthy of service or protection. Inquiries and special units will not change an attitude. Inherent disrespect, lack of concern for certain members of society has resulted in numerous tragedies. We had a couple of ladies here last month who told us, treat others as you would like to be treated. But that cannot be just words that we hear when we come to the police board meetings. All lives matter. But the police force does not reflect that belief. Actions are everything. Actions, not words. Gloria from Human Resources told us months ago, it will take years for the TPS to reflect the core values that the way forward would like everyone to do. But clearly we can't wait for 20 years to go by before we see success. No one at this table is going to still be here in 20 years. What would happen, ladies and gentlemen, if you were told by people from Rosedale that 6 or 7 people had gone missing? Would the police be lackadaisical and responding, to the fact that 6 or 7 people were missing in Rosedale? Would there have been suggestions that it was their imagination? Suggestions that they're suffering from paranoia and not suggesting something sinister was going on? The police are guilty of willful blindness and failure to serve and protect. Our police chief has to now stand up. Our police chief, our new police chief, Chief Mark Saunders, has to stand up and take a leadership role, not telling us about some new unit, because the new unit is just going to repeat what we already have wrong. It's not going to change anything. It's just going to be that we're going to tell each other we have a new unit. This should be viewed as criminal acts. When the police do not do their duty, the police officers guilty of not doing their duty should be viewed as criminals. To the long list of those not served that I've repeated over and over again, the poor, the homeless, the mentally ill, the crippled, the handicapped, Aboriginals, elderly, blacks, homosexuals, not worthy of police service, and indeed have been encouraged. The police themselves are encouraged to think they're different from society, and they have the attitude they're not the same as the rest of society, and I've spoken about that several times and been ignored and laughed at. I'm sick of being laughed at, I'm sick of being called names, and I'm sick of being ignored, especially after the recent events of the last few weeks. I would like the police to stop with this encouragement of the police having cliques, of the police not demonstrating their empathy for society because they're not part of society. Could we please move forward the cultural change right up to the top of the list and put that at the top of the list and everything else after it, every single thing else. Thank you for your time.
Brenda, thank you. Colleagues, questions of Ms. Ross? Brenda, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Becky McFarland, who is the Senior Director of Program and Services at the 519. Becky, thank you for coming. I'll give you 5 minutes, and I'll give you a 1-minute warning.
Great.
Thanks.
So the 519 has already submitted a written submission. I just wanted to highlight 3 important things from our perspective. The first, and I'm reiterating a lot of what I think some of the former speakers have said. The first, that the establishment of this external working group, which will establish, I think, another external review or reviews or groups. The notion that it's representative of the experiences and knowledge of those most vulnerable in our communities. I think that's a critical point. I'd like to add to that, and again, reiterating racialized communities, trans communities, sex workers, homeless communities, that also whomever is engaged in that work and whomever is invited to participate in those conversations from a leadership point of view are compensated for their time. I think it is incredibly important when you're inviting people to participate in processes where they're attempting to fix problems that aren't really of their own making, that their experience is valued, and that they're compensated for their time. So that was the first point I wanted to make. I think that remembering that this particular situation we're talking about doesn't exist in a vacuum, and that the way in which we need to approach the development of terms of reference for this review should not be ahistorical in the way in which it thinks about these problems sort of broadly. I had the opportunity to talk to Jane Doe, who reached out to the 519 in the hopes of being able to share some of her experiences going through a very long process on issues that are stunningly similar in relation to issues of the duty to warn, of issues of bias within the Toronto Police Service. And what came out of that conversation for me was that it took 20 years to get to the point where the committee that was contemplating a lot of the recommendations, an implementation plan for everything that came through that process was disbanded. And I have to say that there is no way that this community can wait 20 years through whatever external review processes and inquiries are established to try to understand what I think has been understood in a million inquiries, in a million external reviews, in a million mechanisms that have existed historically. We need to draw on that information, and we need to figure out how to cut our timelines a little bit in terms of how we engage in this kind of process. Because I don't think anybody really feels like they have 20 years to invest in this. And I fear that if that isn't kind of established up front, which leads me to saying I think that what is missing from this particular motion is the notion of how to make what comes out of these processes actionable and accountable to some kind of timelines. Because I think what we don't want is a scenario where we get to the end of a process and then have to have a conversation about how we action what we learn through that process. And I guess, you know, it's so hard to imagine that the grief, so much of the grief that exists in the community is preventable. The grief that people experience now, preventable. The grief that people are going to experience into the future, preventable. We know that we don't even know everything, right? And we know that there is going to be more grief. We also know, because I work in an organization where people come to us all the time, either afraid to report issues of violence that they experience in the community, or try to report, and often their experiences are incredibly negative. So what we know is even as we sit here today, people are going through those systemic issues we're attempting to solve. People are continuing to experience those barriers, that the lack of access to justice. And so if there's nothing that feels more imperative to me than figuring out a way to move through this quickly. And one last point I wanted to make, just because it's important to me, is there is a way in which even still, through this conversation, people conflate humanity with lifestyle. And I think that this notion of how we talk about how people talk about our experiences, how we talk about each other's experiences, are relegated to this notion of the choices that we make or the behavior we engage in, as opposed to being able to understand that what is going on all around us is about people's humanity and a lack of understanding of people's right to be who they are. And so even how I hear people talking, what gets stuck in people's throats, the way that people can't even talk about queer and trans lives in a way that feels empowering, that I really think everyone at this table needs to think about the ways in which they feel uncomfortable about having this conversation, and check that as they move forward, trying to lead us through a process where we do not find ourselves sitting here in 20 years having the same conversation.
Becky, thank you very much. That's very well done, very powerful, and thank you. We appreciate it. Colleagues, questions of Becky? Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. I draw your attention, colleagues, to Councillor Kristen Won-Tam's presentation as well. So, colleagues, I now throw it open to question, debate, discussion. Councillor Carroll.
Yes, I think probably staff can draw something up, and I whispered in the mayor's ear that the idea that probably the best way to deal with Susan Gapka's suggestion of a recommendation is to just take the whole thing and forward it to this body that's reporting back in June, so that they could just incorporate it in the terms of reference. If you were going to do that partnership consultation, how would you do it? Just incorporate it so it comes back with the actions that are recommended, and then we can vote on doing that today and be assured of that. I just want to say that the last deputant, I think, really put the nail on the head. There is going to be a lot of cynicism surrounding this if we don't acknowledge that we've already had this conversation so many times. There's an old quote when we were a bunch of activist moms getting ready to be activists about education back when we all went and sat with the quite aged Ursula Franklin in her little salon she had in the school, and we all talked about how awful it was going to be and how terrible all of this was, and she said to us, she let us go for about an hour and then said, okay, when you're done awfulizing, what are you going to do? And I've never gotten over that word awfulizing. We have a tendency to call a consultation, and we can be, because it's consultation night, very respectful in terms of letting people vent. And then what we're hearing is that nothing happens afterwards. Or we make recommendations and then we get a report that says, tick a box, we did them. But clearly we didn't if nothing feels any different outside on the ground. And I hate to say this, it will probably flare things up and people will be upset, but this is essentially what happened with Pacer. You know, nothing feels any different in many, many communities, and yet we got a report saying of all those Pacer recommendations, I think there are 28, 29, 2/3 of them are done. Tick a box, they're all done. And if that is the case, why are we still talking about anti-Black racism in policing? So I think it is going to be really, really important to come out of this with recommendations, but I think the rush part that they're asking for is let's rush past the awfulizing and really start talking about the actions we need to see. And then the part where we're going to need to take the more meaningful amount of time and get real is the action part. And so, you know, we can wait till June to find the terms of reference, but the terms of reference shouldn't include just awfulizing for 3 years while people continue to feel they're being criminalized for who they are. And then the action part, that should be the part that takes 3 years, because we should see real change. Thank you. Those are my comments.
Colleagues, Ken, you first, and then Upla.
Yes, what we've been hearing a lot of here is the repetition of initiatives, and that's one of my concerns about what were the barriers and what are the barriers that make it so difficult for sustaining any kind of change. I would like us to explore that with this review committee. However, I directly to the Chief, a question to you as well. In this review committee, there would be opportunities for communities to understand investigative procedures and what have you. I'm particularly also sensitive to the fact that you may have some techniques, and you meaning the police, that shouldn't be disclosed, so that in terms of investigative initiatives that you take, right, so that others would know what to try and avoid for those who have really, bad intentions. So how is there differentiation with the techniques of investigation and the relationship with with communities like the LGBTQ community and others that are not happening? Are they two separate, or two? Explain to me how that can work.
I'm not quite sure if the question, I can conclude with that as an organization, we want to get this right, and we understand what the issues and the concerns are. So I don't want us to come across as obstructionists. I want that open opportunity to hear what needs to be heard so that we can move forward. With respect to procedure policies, we don't generally put them on the table, and we don't give the playbook of things we're supposed to do, but we do listen. And if there are things that we need to add on, and if we do have the right groups in front of us to have that conversation to help us improve on what we're doing, that will be an active role that we will definitely be a participant of.
So maybe a little bit more specific. In terms of what is requested of us here to have this review body, I'm just trying to understand, I'm hearing loud and clear the understanding of the LGBTQ community in this case around, the relations are not very good, right? I'm hearing that. That's one major issue. The other I'm asking about is that when, people are not happy about the way in which it was investigated, I'm saying that I was suggesting that there are techniques that you use that you may want to, not all the public, to know how you're going to reconcile that. That's
I hope the chair can correct me, but I'm hoping that the terms of reference will be taking these aspects into consideration so that when that does present itself, we have the right answers and everybody at the front of the conversation knows exactly what the expectations are and what our involvement and what our role will be.
Yes, I agree. Any other follow-up, Ken? Is it okay? Any other questions, or comments? Ms. Chandra-Casera, you had.
Thank you. Mine's more a comment and just thinking through what's been shared here. And repeatedly over and over, what we're hearing is that though community does not feel heard on this issue, the issue of bias has come forward several times from the deputant, and I was happy to see that in Mayor Tory's motion. I think bias is conscious and unconscious. We're not sometimes even aware that it's happening. So one of the things that I think that we can't forget in this review is this concept of intersectionality, because there's so many overlapping issues that are happening here, especially when we think about what's been shared to date on from these communities about their concerns. So what I'd like to really see happen is how we're going to consult the LGBT community, especially in the forming of the scope of this review. And for us to think about, do we hold a consultation before that scope is finalized? And whether it's, you have this smaller group, which is, 4 members coming together, draft something. But I think it is in the interest of the public for us to have something more public where people can give us concrete input into what the scope should be, because it's very broad. There's systemic pieces, it's interpersonal, structural, organizational, and then let's not forget what Susan Gapka mentioned, which is that there's a lot of mistrust in the community. So if there's some way that we can make that, as we're determining the scope, if that part could be more open, that could also be a starting point to rebuilding that trust with that community as well.
One final comment
Yes,
around
Mr.
this.
Jones. Yep.
The OHRC, the Ontario Human Rights Commission, is there a role that for them to be playing in all of this? Because I'm sometimes amazed that the OHRC is not, with its different levels of expertise and so forth, they're not an integral part of human rights concerns and questions,
We will be looking to get input from the community. I'm charged with coming back with the makeup of a working group to go forward. So I would hope to hear from the Human Rights Commission, but if you recommend we should reach out to them, that's something we can do.
To recommend that the Human Rights Commission be involved, an integral part of this whole review as well.
Any other suggestions? Any other comments, colleagues? Mayor Tory, anything you wish to, before we vote on these and
No, I just want to
receive the two
express, I
depositions?
think we've learned quite a bit, and I think comments just made about, finding ways to make sure we broaden out the consultation, I think respond to some of what we heard from the deputants. And I think part of what the working group will look at is whether organizations like the Human Rights Commission can play a role. That's precisely what they're looking at, which is who should do this and what it should do and so forth. So I think it's been a good discussion and very helpful.
Okay, so with that, then, if there's no more comments or questions, we need a couple of resolutions. One, motion to receive 6.1, which is the Chief's, Councillor Carroll, seconded, Ms. Mulliner, all in favor. Second, a motion to receive the deputations that we had, Councillor Carroll, seconded, Ms. Mulliner again, all in favor. Any contrary? And finally, the motion to approve the resolution put forward by the mayor. Yes. Well, with the addition, as Councillor Carroll said, that we will add in the reference to Ms. Gupka's suggestion referred to the committee once it's struck. So a motion to approve Mayor Tory's moving it, seconded by Councillor Lee. All in favor? Any contrary? Carried unanimously. Thank you. That takes us now to item number 7. Councillor Carroll, that was your hold, the org chart.
Tab 7, this was just a quick one. I just note in the org chart that in the report about it, it kind of looks, it stands out a little bit. When you look at the org chart, under Special Ops, we're taking all the things under Special Operations Command, and all of them will remain unchanged. It looks sort of like the forgotten pillar that we're not making a lot of changes in, but that's simply no change in staffing, right? A lot of the technological changes are actually going to play out in these types of operations, are they not?
Yes, first and foremost, I can say that there have been changes, maybe not in titles and boxes within the org chart,
Yeah.
but there have been changes with respect to our roles and responsibilities and our approaches in which we've been trying to deliver the services aligning with the priorities of the way forward. So there have been changes, but the boxes don't clearly show that.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. That was all I wanted. I can move that one, yeah.
Councillor Carroll moving
Sure.
the approval of item number 7. May I have a seconder? Ms. Santa Casera, the org chart. All in favor? Any contrary? Carried unanimously. I'm going to just jump ahead here because we have a guest who's been very patient, and that is one of the committee members of the external review of the historic data, and that's former Justice Thea Herman. And I just want to not waste any more of her time by getting to that item. And so I draw your attention to item number 13, which is a complex one, but it deals with the historic data, the chief's report on a couple of occasions, and then the recommendation of the review panel. And there's actually a changed motion given to that, which is on the board, given the fact that we have a number of moves in play here, including Justice Michael Tulloch looking at this from a provincial point of view. So the motion up there is that the board receive the 3rd and 4th quarter reports from the chief and defer consideration of the report from the Regulated Interactions Review Panel until the board has met with Justice Michael Tulloch as part of the consultation process arising from the independent review of the Regulation 5816 initiated by the province. So that's perhaps a more elegant way of dealing with the same thing. But as I say, Thea Herman's if they're here, or so if there are any questions of her about the report, we can do that as well. Colleagues? Councillor Carroll?
Well, I had a question, but it's more a question of the chief and his staff than of the review panel.
Shoot.
Oh, okay, just so that the panel member can hear it. I just wonder if you could refresh my memory, because it will be later on that you're considering it, but here we are with all the data. The issue of the role-based access, those are fairly senior roles. So I'm still trying to get a handle on how many people it takes to take care of access. So there's role-based access that rests with 8 senior positions. Who actually physically goes and looks up and gets the stuff for those people?
You're talking operational, or I don't know.
Well,
So I'm not sure what you say when you say role-based.
Let me find the page for you. It's sorry, I'm trying to do a battery save thing. Sorry. Sorry, I'm on another tab because it's on page 3 of the report, role-based security access. The service has eliminated access to historical for all service members, with the exception of a select group of members who have been authorized by the chief to access the database only for the purposes. Now, later in the report, it explains that there are only 8 people who are allowed to authorize access. But I'm assuming that they don't then, especially given we still have some of the legal inquiries coming forth, I'm assuming that those 8 important people don't physically go and get all the stuff. So how many people truly have physical access to the stuff?
I've got on page 5, it states that initial complement of 31 members are facilitated access.
Oh, okay, so it's still controlled, which that number has remained constant. That's still where we're at.
I believe that's where we're at, and I think the discussion was to have a look at that later on down the line.
Yeah.
No, that's one of the concerns of the,
Yeah.
Ted, do you want to come up and just
I just
weigh
wanted
in on
to
that?
keep that in mind. I missed that later on down the report, that it's still in the realm of 31. So it's not growing, but there still is
Not
the
growing,
reason to
and
review it.
the externals,
Okay.
the requests for externals have fallen over the
Yeah,
quarters.
I get the
You've
whole
seen.
rest of the report. I just
Okay.
missed that number, and I read the whole report. I don't know how I missed that one number, but I swear I read the report. So we still get there's a rationale for the recommendation that we can start looking at destruction of the data. We're going to have our conversation with the justice because the province is also looking at that. I just wanted assurance that while we're waiting, and because we're going to delay it, that number of people isn't growing, and it's been 30 or 31 since we started. So I'm comfortable.
Closer to the mic.
People who have access to the data. There are 23, I believe, who have access for what's called administrative purposes, which is mostly FOI, and not the primary focus of what the concern was, which is access by members of the service. The FOI is people seeking their own information. We don't know how many of those 1,400 are actually accessing the historical contact data because that hasn't been done before, but they've implemented a new system to try and track how many of that 1,400 is actually historical contact data. But again, that's mostly FOI and is people seeking their own information. The real concern is the operational, the access by members of the service. And those are 8 people who have authorized access to that information. And the numbers of actual times it's been accessed have been very small. In the last 6 months of 2018, there were 8 in total that were authorized, and 5 of the 8 were for purposes of an ongoing investigation. So it's very small. There are 8 people who have access to it. I understand that the chief has indicated that there are reasons for that, particularly for ongoing investigations, which are not a 9 to 5 issue, but we were concerned about the number of 8 when all we're looking at is a handful of actual access instances, and wondering whether the board wanted to reconsider whether the data should be accessed at all. We're talking about a handful of access to it, and there are a lot of concerns about the access, so it's something that perhaps Justice Tulloch in his review could look at, and a useful reconsideration of that issue.
Yeah, certainly, Councillor Carroll.
So just on follow-up, I don't know how much document access the board has, or the review panel, I should say. Is it safe to say that the main reason people are accessing their own information is that they're concerned that it's there? And if we were to say we're getting rid of it, we wouldn't have the 1,400 FOI requests. They only need to know what's there because it is in fact here. And if we took it away, their concern goes away.
I don't know the answer to that. And I don't know how many of those 1,400 actually involve access to the historical data, although we should be finding that out in the coming year because they've implemented a tracking system.
Yes, okay, thank you.
But I don't know the answer to your question as to whether if all that information disappeared, whether there'd be concerns on the FOI end of it.
Colleagues, any other questions while Dave's here? Yeah, listen, thank you very much, and thank Audrey too. I'm the least significant member of that committee. You guys do all the work, but thank you very much.
My pleasure.
So colleagues, with that, may I have, I think we need to do receive 13.1 and 13.2 and approve the motion that's up there of 13.3. Can we lump all 3 together? Is it fine with colleagues? Okay, Ms. Mulliner, seconded by Councillor Carroll. All in favor? Any contrary? Thank you, and thank you again for being here today as well. So that's 13, but we'll go back now to the next hold was number 9, and that, Shelley, was you, the new job description of purchasing specialist.
Yeah, just a couple of quick questions for Mr. Veneziano. I support the idea of of reducing the amount of contracting and actually putting people in place in a new structure, given that there's a lot of tech involved in transformation, and consultants on tech procurement tend to be the top dollar. They're not cheap. I'm just wondering if you could assure us, if we get into looking at Big Buy for some of the things that are coming up, and then we get into the situation in that other place where I work, where the successful proponent starts talking about, well, this is such a big thing, we'll put a consultant in the area for you as you take the stuff on board. That'll be a sort of a partly help you with procurements for future add-ons and also help you implement. What I'm getting at is, as we start to go through, connected officer, body-worn cameras, all the things that we have coming down the pipe in the near future that have that component of it, if we get into a situation where folks are recommending a consultant, that would have to somehow come out of this increased amount we're giving you. You'd have to find it in that structure or change the structure again. That we can't spend an extra $60,000 a year to reduce consulting and then later on down the line bring a consultant back. Has that been looked at?
Yes, and in fact, the consultants was really more of a short term in terms of what we're going through right now, but we'll be going through for some time in terms of the Way Forward report and a lot of the initiatives that are coming on in that regard, as well as the Policing Effectiveness Modernization Grant and some of the asks that we're trying to do that. But what this is really all about is professionalizing, modernizing, and enabling a support function to actually support innovation and moving forward in the organization. There will be no additional ask unless there's a capacity or unless we get jammed with a whole bunch of projects at the same time. If we get this structure, we will have the skill set at a much more senior level that has experience in doing some of the large procurements, and really the only consultant that I see coming on board for large complex projects, and this is a City of Toronto policy and one policy that we have also taken on, and that's a fairness commissioner. And that's really to protect the organization as well as the public in terms of making sure that the process that is being followed is fair, open, and transparent. So the $60,000, in my view, is quite frankly a very small investment in terms of the return that the organization is going to get to move us forward in professionalizing that whole function.
How did you arrive at the new classification for a senior procurement specialist? And what are the competencies for that? What do they have to come in the door with?
So that actually, a job description was prepared for both that position as well as the procurement specialist position. Mm-hmm. That goes to our labor and job evaluation unit in HR, and they actually evaluate it. But the expectation is that they bring perhaps a more innovative approach to procurement. Right now, procurement is in government in general is very risk averse, and that actually gets in the way of progress. So we've got to kind of balance it a little bit more. So we're actually coming to the table with solutions that will allow us to have a fair and open process, but at the same time allow us to explore new technologies and other initiatives that will actually enable and benefit the organization. So that's the type of skill set. And when you look at it, and we have benchmarked ourselves against other public sector organizations, we're pretty tight. I mean, we're actually below, even with this additional ask. And the reason we are below is because we do a lot of shared procurement now with the city as well as the PCPG. So we're really trying to take a much more strategic approach. Right now, the manager of procurement is a working manager, if I can call her that. She not only does the strategic and the management and the planning, but she also does the actual procurement. that takes away from her actually becoming more strategic and looking at technology to actually help us move forward.
Okay, those are my questions.
Any other questions, colleagues? Ms. Santa-Casera?
Thank you for this. I thought the details are really well done. I have a comment and a question. So I'm a little bit concerned about the salary scale. I have to be honest, because this is a back office function. And just so you know, I come from the world of healthcare. And these types of salary scales are typically not, like, you know, in healthcare, this is more for a director level salary. So I'm wondering, what's the benchmark you're using for these salary scales?
Again, it does go through a job evaluation process. It's actually done by an outside firm, Mercer's, who helps us with those. And they have a template, I guess, if you want to call it, with various criteria, that they look at the job descriptions, the duties and responsibilities, and actually measure that against a scale. And based on that and the points that actually come out, that determines at what level that position is rated at. So the senior procurement specialist is really the sort of right-hand person for the manager and is expected to take on very, very complex procurements. As an example, some of the contractors that we're using now are probably costing us twice as much as what a senior procurement specialist would cost us. So to me, it's wasted money, quite frankly. It's money that we could better spend internally and maintain that knowledge base that we would need moving forward.
I think the point's a good one, though, Tony, in that, and we've heard it before in the Transformational Task Force, that the level of our general remuneration for non-uniform staff is at the very high level of what comparables would be like in the healthcare or the provincial sector. And so it's something that, you know, we really need to address going forward.
I think part of the problem is it's an inward-looking process right now. It's part of the collective agreement, and so something that probably should be looked at down the line. When you look at the high end, it's probably at the support level. When you're talking about subject matter experts in IT or in functions like this, then I'm not saying we're the highest or lowest paid, but we're probably in and around the middle, maybe ahead of some areas, but maybe below other areas. But comparable to the City of Toronto, we're actually a little bit lower than what they're currently paying.
I guess since I've heard this a number of times, I'd like to see something come back from you that kind of puts that in context with the healthcare, with the City of Toronto, and with Marie, you've got experience in government as well. Is there anything that you think of that we should benchmark off to get some sense?
I think the public sector also has similar roles, so it would be useful to add that, whether it's at the provincial or federal level.
We can certainly bring back comparators, but as far as the evaluation of the position description that was put forward, that's really an independent evaluation that we really can't, we're really not in a position to sort of tamper with. But we can bring comparators back so that it gives the board an idea of what sort of...
I'd like to know then about the firm that's doing the comparisons, because, you know, either they do it for other police services, what are their qualifications to do that? Because, again, it is a question that keeps coming back. So I would like to see that come back from you within a month. It shouldn't be long to do that.
I want to just point out that and I want to be cautious because with the aggressive timelines with board reports and requests, there are some concerns that I have with the timelines and the asks that are coming across, because we're going, everything seems to be moving in a shorter time frame, and I'm looking at the work that is being required, number one. And number two, in all fairness, these discussions, if someone can correct me, are collective agreement discussions. And I want to make sure whether or not this is a forum to have this type of narrative or discussion. So if I could get some clarification on that, that would be great.
Joanne, while they do touch on the collective agreement, it's information we're asking for. So I would like to know about the comparators. How long do you think you need if a month is too short?
I'm hearing that our requests for the next 2 months are pretty aggressive. If this is a priority,
It's not a huge priority, but I wouldn't mind getting the information because we are engaged in bargaining towards the end of this year. So I'd like to know beforehand and
Okay.
get the research done.
Okay, can I report back to you for next month to
Yes,
have
you may.
more definitive? Thank you.
Any other questions, colleagues? If not, a motion to approve item number 9, the purchasing service reorganization. Ms. Mulliner, seconded. Councillor Lee, all in favor? Any contrary? Okay, thank you. Item number 10 is the response to jury recommendations of the coroner's inquest into the death of Randy Loco. There are a number of deputations.
Mr. Chair, before we proceed, I
yes?
have a question about process,
Yep.
and I apologize in advance if this was unexpected. After hearing the conversation around the missing persons, the deputants, and a strong sense that we are very aware that we will, as a service and as a board, want to pay close attention to the systemic barriers that may be identified, I'm mindful that in accepting this report, we may be putting ourselves in a situation where we could have done better. So what I'm asking for guidance on is in receiving this report, do we automatically then own the service's recommendations in which they are, at this point, saying that they do not concur on a number of significant areas, which I think actually flow actually demonstrate the possibility of bias. So I'm asking whether or not we have to accept it and then hear everything, or whether we should defer it and take the time to go back with the service and say, are you sure you cannot concur with these recommendations?
There are 3, this is item number 10. I think the 3 deputations, I think we should hear those first at a minimum, and then that we get into the general discussion about exactly that. Chief Saunders, you had your hand up. Is there something you...
Yeah, I just want this whole dialogue to be in the spirit of where the organization stands with the issues that are at hand, and to let you know that we take all of these issues serious, and there is no closed door policy on learning, on developing, and on enhancing what we can do to enhance our public value within a community. So this is something that, even though we've responded to this report, there are no doors closed in any conversation or narrative that needs to be necessary to move forward.
Okay. With that then, colleagues, if you're fine, we'll go on to the deputations, which there are 3 of them.
Does that mean we are accepting to receive the report?
The motion
So we
come
go
after.
through all of
That's
this?
right.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Brian DeMattis? Okay, I don't see Brian. Don Waits? Okay. Steve, I do see you. Come on. Steve, you know the rules, 5 minutes, and I'll give you a 1-minute warning. Thank you for coming, and thank you also for giving us something written as well. We appreciate
Yeah, so
both of those.
I will try and address most of what's in my written and make a couple other comments as well. I've been involved with TPS. Is there something I need to do? Yeah. A little closer. It's sort of like singing, I guess, yeah. Okay, I've been involved with TPS on this file really since Dominic Sabatino was shot in 1992. And I must say that the TPS, both at the board level and certainly at the operational level, has really upped its game. There's no question. I remember that Deputy Chief Charlie Maywood called a bunch of us into a meeting in 1992 and said, you know, we've got what was then the Clark Institute involved. They're doing training, and it was the end of the story. So now you actually have, you know, Inspector Body and Mike Federico before him, and a whole infrastructure that tries to deal with how do we improve policing with regards to people living with mental health and addictions issues. And, you know, the issues of intersectionality that you heard on previous items are right in front of us. I think there is an opportunity, though, for TPS to continue to up its game and For example, shortly, the OIPRD review on interactions, police interactions with the mentally ill will be out. That has included an audit of various police services' response to previous inquest recommendations. So there'll be another body of information that this organization can use because it goes back over 25 years around all kinds of interactions that unfortunately resulted in death or serious injury. I've had a chance to review your response to the inquest, and again, as I said previously around the board's response earlier in the new year, it's clear that you're committed to trying to do better. Chair Pringle asked me and a bunch of much more illustrious people to be part of the expert advisory panel to you I guess it was almost 2 years ago. And Dorothy Cotton, who chaired that panel, made a very important statement that you heard today in respect of other issues. Culture eats strategy for lunch. And so the issue here is really, how do we ensure that a culture of de-escalation emerges, not a culture of the threat is approaching, and we heard that in the inquest testimony, and how do we stop the threat? That is a huge question. The good news is, if you look at your own data, 158 cases a year of use of force relative to well over 20,000 encounters. So it's not like everybody on the force doesn't get it. But what we heard incontrovertibly at the inquest was that the training doesn't stick. You have done an amazing job developing training, and it continues to evolve. The negotiator workshop, the stairway of influence. But the two officers in question at the inquest, when they were shown the stairways of influence, didn't know what they were. And that's all about de-escalation. So that's why we're saying, as you move forward, especially with your two pilot projects, maybe there's an opportunity to try something different. We know that there are huge constraints, as were evidenced around training at the platoon level, but there are weekly platoon meetings. And evidence emerged at the inquest that every day there are 75 encounters with emotionally disturbed people, roughly 6 to 10 per division. So each division may have 40 to 60 a week. Why couldn't we build in to the weekly meetings with the training sergeants a discussion about, okay, we've had these EDP encounters, which ones went well, which ones didn't go so well, and you begin to look at themes and trends, and then you can adjust training accordingly. That is what we do in the human services. It's called reflective practice, and I think it would be a really strong thing to do. We are thrilled that you are going to have a written exam on after ISTP, showing whether people actually know how to do de-escalation. I think it'll be really important that you report publicly on those results. There has been an item of contention all the way along around whether the Hamilton model, where they suggest that they do use an MCIT as a primary response on occasion, and there's no clarity on that one. So I'd suggest you follow up on that. I think the final thing I'd like to say, as Andy's put his finger up there, is that it's really important that you publicly report on use of force as well. And in your statement of commitment, you made, this force has talked about 0 deaths and 0 harm. I think that needs to be front and center.
Thank you, Steve. Colleagues, questions? Shelley.
Yeah, you touched in your presentation on the issue of using debrief, what went well, what didn't go well. I'm wondering if you have a comment. I don't think either the coroner or our management response goes far enough on this one. There seems to be a suggestion maybe you could do this, and in the response, no, we don't concur, because it would take a whole bunch of special training. If we're hiring managers, promoting managers, and I'm not going to be using the correct uniform rank, but the people who are mentoring every constable who goes out the door in the morning, is it your opinion that it needs a whole lot of special training to get to the point where those people can hear about a de-escalation that was classic textbook, this is exactly what we want to see happening, and this is a great report, this is exactly what the training suggests you should do, why wouldn't he share that with all the other officers? How much special training would that take?
I think this question of debriefing has been an issue of contention since Justice Iacobucci's report, and I think part of the challenge is when you have a use of force incident that might be the subject of an inquest, that might be the subject of an SIU investigation, and will undoubtedly have been traumatic for the officers. I think your advice that you've gotten is you have to be cautious on. In some of those instances, you just can't do the instant debrief. But the point I'm making is that many of your encounters actually work out okay.
Yes.
Some of them work out not so well. So let's not call it a debrief. I think you could draw a line and say, if this is likely or the subject of an external investigation or even an internal investigation, maybe you follow the existing procedures you have. But most of the times, it's really a question of lining up, well, what actually happened? And not only that, you've got an app now where officers can try and connect people with available community services. That would be interesting information, because my bet is it's going to be still pretty tough, but at least then you'd be able to document it.
Right. And so we're getting hung up on with respect, because there's a lot of space here taken up in describing why we can't debrief. It's a resource issue, it's an everything issue, a time issue. But if we're talking about using the positive outcomes to continually drive home the training, we should call it something other than debriefing and get rid of this issue that has gone on.
Well, I think it's both positive and challenging outcomes, but maybe it doesn't need to be called debriefed. I think you could put a group together with some folks from healthcare who do this all the time. For example, we have assertive community treatment teams. Every day they have a morning meeting. They have 90 minutes, and they review what's going on with 90 clients. Mm-hmm. So there are ways that, and I think you could play with some methodology. And I think that's why I propose that you try it as a pilot in the two divisions that you've already identified to do more work. I mean, Jennifer's in the audience, and she's going to be working with those two divisions and you around upping the game and training. So I think there are lots of opportunities. And you could Haley Hartley, who's working for the Ontario Public Service now around helping them digitize, says her strategy is fail small rather than fail big. So I think if you sort of try some things out and do a plan, do, study, act approach in divisions, and you could see which other divisions are interested in signing up. But again, I think this is the way that you try and have the conversation. And also remember, we've made, through the Human Service and Justice Committee, available to you, there's online training, and so having some of those discussions would work as well.
Any other questions, colleagues of Steve? Steve, thank you. That was very thoughtful and very useful. Thank you.
Thanks.
So there is a motion to do that's been put up, and Marie may adjust some of your concerns. Ms. Chandra-Casera, you have something you want to start off, or Marie, do you want to start off here?
So again, the process is we first have to receive the report before we entertain this motion, and that's what I wanted to check.
No. Yes.
So help me out here. What I'm trying to determine is whether or not, based on the report that we've seen, which after this day, which I think has made a lot of us rethink the whole continuum of bias and where the intersections happen, whether we want to accept this report or suggest to staff that, based on what they've heard, they might want to go back and look at all the do not concurs or concur in part, flesh them out with a reconsideration about the future, the culture change that's going to be required. So I'm asking that question, but whether we want to have...
We can do anything we want here. If we've heard the deputations, we've got the report, and normally we would go forward to approve it. If we've got concerns, this motion being part of it, we can address, we can do whatever we want. And Shelley, this is the time, if there are questions of staff, to ask those.
I would suggest it's great to talk about a course of action, but to send them away and expect to see anything different come back. If we ask our questions, we'll be telegraphing where we have problems here, and they will then have have the ability to know where the board's head is at as they go away to rethink things. Yeah, so
That's fine, thank you.
We'll do our stuff through it, and then I think that is a great.
So do you have a question for the staff?
I have many questions for staff.
Well, start, please.
Let us start with recommendation number 8, which is the, and I'm even more mindful of it now, which is the issue of the police command of police don't move. We've heard the police challenge, it's called. We've heard, and I think it's fair. We've heard from a deputant that in some instances it looks as if the training isn't sticking. I was really happy to see that and to experience it when I went to do the training, that it isn't drop your weapon, because we know drop your weapon seldom happens if we're dealing with someone in a mental health crisis. Pardon me, but I'm just wondering if the chief has an opinion on whether or not the changing it to police don't move and the warnings, is that working so far? Can we reinforce it when we're now expanding the deployment of tasers? Is that another opportunity to continue to drive home what the police challenge should be and making sure we're consistently using it?
I just want to be clear that anytime we do any training involving the incident response training unit, there's a lot of comprehensive research that is done, and that research allows us the opportunity to try to establish what the best practice is. And when we go through research, whether it be reading articles, whether it be doing the worldwide study, and I see included here again is to look at other agencies, which we do, but we'll continue to do that. We do take heed to what the reasons are for why we do what we do. If the question is to look at, is there a best practice on what the challenge should be when dealing with certain situations, that has been done, but we'll be willing to do that again. As with this report as well, if there are issues of concern that need to be re-looked at, I don't mind taking the opportunity of getting clarification with the board's guidance on what the focal points are. So I put that to the board.
Okay. Recommendation number 9 is the one about the debriefs, and I got into that conversation with Mr. Lurie. This one really shocked me because there's a lot of explanation about why we can't, why we best not, I suppose I should say, why we best not do debriefing of difficult experiences and incidents, and I get that for all of the levels outlined in here. I get that. But so much space goes into it that there is no mention of why we can't concur at least with what we're going to do with positive outcomes. When you see just fantastic use of training on a standout incident, and it's one of those ones that maybe gets around the division. Wow, that was, there were 4 of us there, and that was awesome. You really talked that guy down. Why can't that become something that is emanated out? Let's make sure that there is a sort of mentoring grapevine that rewards that by making sure that every officer's hear about, we saw some perfect de-escalation. Boy, that guy's career is on the move, because that is what we want to see in a police. Why is there nothing in here about the ability to concur with that recommendation? That's just not acceptable to me. I'll say it up front.
Chris, I see you moving into position to answer. I'm here first. So the risk of piling on, and I think Ms. Shanack-Becerra is going to pile on top as well. I recall, and Chris, you were there when Steve was alluding to, we had the external review people. And it was really Frank Yagabuchi who asked the question, if, I forget which incident, hadn't resulted in the death of SIU, would we have gone back and debriefed? And I thought it was a very great question, but yet Deputy Chief Federico at the time stood up and said, no, we don't, that's too difficult, that's too emotional, et cetera, et cetera. I just don't buy that. You know, every business that I'm involved with does exactly that. That's how you get better. And I recognize that there are impediments, just as Steve said, that in some instances, but I would urge us to try and find ways to use that. So when I read that item number 9, it resonated with me. Oopla, sorry.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this is, when I read this, I had a reaction as well. I think I fully accept that this can adversely impact the mental health of officers because they're reliving it or they're talking about an incident that is obviously has been traumatic for everybody. I just want to kind of bring us back to this concept of, in healthcare, we do this all the time, right? And, you know, Steve referred to it as reflective practice, but we also call it quality improvement. And what that means is that you take a step back from what happened, whether positive or negative, and you dissociate. So it's not about blaming the person. I think this is a big fear, right? That this is going to reinforce that someone has done something wrong and really grind them into the ground. That's not the purpose. It's actually look at what were the actions, deconstruct the actions, and then think about how do we do what we call PDSA cycles, plan, do, study, act. And so for this, it just occurred to me, this is a huge missed opportunity for learning. Let's say we put aside the pieces that are going to be internally investigated by SIU and whatnot. Can we focus on the positive things? And it doesn't have to be every single incident, but is there a few that could be done every week? Because this is positive learning. And also, it's a really great communication strategy for the rest of the team to say, okay, you know what? Certain officer on this team did this great job, and here are the steps that worked. And so I really want to know why there's so much hesitation in doing that, because it's also about celebrating what actually did work well, because there's more incidents of where the police got it right than when they got it wrong.
And Aaron, just before Inspector Body speaks, and thank you for framing it that way, because that does go on. We have various committees, including the Use of Force Committee, that has a breakdown of all of our use of force supports that are admitted, looking at the scenarios, looking at what were the best practices, looking at what could be done differently for a more successful outcome, and also celebrating the ones where we do have successful outcomes. That is then put over to the incident response training team, and then they utilize those very tools and those very information in real-time scenarios that are then put in a structured environment. So first a classroom setting, and then of course the application through either through the simulators or through the indoor and outdoor scenarios that we go through with every single officer with the ISTP training that goes on a daily basis, where they're properly evaluated and of course given the positive reinforcements if they do get it right, and then if there are issues that are made, then those are addressed, and the added layer that if there's a failure, that they don't go past that until they go back and until they do get it right and they do understand what those principles are. And then of course on top of that, the Kirkpatrick measuring mechanism to make sure, is that training being applied? Has that training been useful on the ground level? Yes or no? And utilizing that as an aspect to fill in gaps to see what next year's training is going to be. So these are all mechanisms that are in place, that are being used on top of our award ceremonies where we give out awards for de-escalation and things that are used. If you come to our service awards, which I invite everybody to attend, by the way, you will hear of those stories and you'll hear of those celebrations. So we've covered it from the training to the operational to the learned practices to the reward at the end of the day principles. So we've covered all of those, and the question was answered specific to the framing of the wording that was put in number 9, and it wasn't to push back and say, no, we don't. We do it very robustly, but within the frame of the question, that was the answer that was put there. And so if there's a misunderstanding on that, I do apologize.
Mr. Carroll.
Yeah, and I have one other recommendation I want to do, but I will just follow up. That was a great answer, but it really is still wrapped around just training and awards. And I just want to underscore that training, what I noticed is that you really do, to understand it, you really do have to be there for the 3 days, because the first day, everybody's new in class. And by the third day, they've been through scenarios together, video, live, and all the rest, and had big discussions. And so even if they've never worked together in the same division, everybody's sort of starting to think with a collective mind. But what I'm talking about, I hope can somehow be reflected. It needs to be happening in situ, in their division that they report to. They need to be being mentored. Wow, that was an amazing thing that happened the other day. Wow. So that constant positive reinforcement is happening right in their daily lives, not just when they go off to do their training. And I don't know that we do that enough. I do know that when they're up against it, I've witnessed desk sergeants and other ranks being very supportive and making sure that they're keeping track of wellness and such, and there's that rapport. But that gets into a sort of, they spend a lot of time commiserating so that they're all close. There should be a applauding and celebrating and making sure that if that went exactly the way it should, everyone else is reminded that everything we do can go exactly the way it should, right in their own situations. Oh, sir.
And thank you for that. And that is Sheridan. And when we have our advanced leadership training, we talk to our supervisors about this and recognizing and looking for, and those opportunities are in fact celebrated at a divisional level. And some of those moments are brought up to the upper command level, which then converts into those awards. So the awards don't represent the number of times that it's done. When our actions are showing that when it comes to our use of force and it is point something, then that is a very fair statement that not only are they applying de-escalation when they are in their interactions on a day-to-day basis, and if they don't have the terminology in court, I can appreciate that. My frontline people are going to be measured on their behaviors and their actions in that particular situation. So not understanding behavioral staircase in a moment does not reflect on how they behave. And I can tell you that when you look at the numbers and what is going on, the frontline understand de-escalation. They understand when to use it, and they've been measured and trained accordingly. And I think that that's something that needs to be clarified as well.
There's only one other recommendation that I want to zero in on. And again, this is one where I kind of think the coroner didn't go far enough in what they put in their recommendations. So it's certainly not zeroing in just on the Toronto Police Service, but it is the one recommendation 13. Sorry. My Dristan's wearing off. Recommendation 13, when making decisions about promotions, supervisors should consider an officer's skill and experience in dealing with emotionally disturbed persons, members of the Black community and racialized communities, including their ability to de-escalate and negotiate during crisis situations. In this one, I'm really troubled when, I don't think it should considered. I think it should evaluate, and there are hard criteria, and if you are not good in these situations, you're not getting promoted. But they haven't gone that far. But that being said, I was kind of concerned to read the service does not currently have metrics in place to measure an officer's skill and experience in dealing with members of the Black community and racialized communities. There are assessment tools available out there in the management world to assess just that. And it would appear that we're not currently using them. I don't think you should be able to get above a certain rank if we cannot assess your ability and skills in working with racialized communities in a city like Toronto. So I would, if this report is going to go back to you and come back, I'd sure like to see a better answer there.
And if I can just add. Sorry, I just want to add to number 13 so we don't go back and forth, but I fully agree with what you said, Councillor Carroll, and I think this has to be a core function and a core competency of policing. And this is what transformation is about. This is how we can show the community that we know the police have the skill set to do this. And I think we hear that over and over and over today in the deputations. But if you're getting 75, 80 calls for people in crisis every day, this has to be a core competency, how the escalation is done and how officers actually respond to that. And I think, like Councillor Keller said, there are tools out there to determine how that's most effective. And I would also like to see that built into part of the human resource strategy and the core competencies.
Mayor Tory?
My shortest speech ever, I agree.
Get that in the minutes, would you please? Yes, Ken.
Yes, to Shirley's point, I think, no, I certainly agree that, I mean, there are all kinds of ways of evaluating and confirming the requirement of understanding, racialized communities and making that a part of a human resources priority, right? I think the message has to be very clear, and so that it becomes a bread and butter issue as far as other people are concerned, that they may not be motivated out of any other thing else, but certainly this is an expectation. Our whole effort on modernization and describing the changes in community and the diversity. I mean, we have to minimize the cynicism out there that, as has been said here, a few times, words and words and words. Okay.
Ms. Molnar?
So we've reviewed most of the recommendations that I had comments on, and I'm not going to revisit the other ones because I think the general tone is the same. And my overall observation is that the services response is in fact much stronger than it presents on this paper. We've heard some responses from the chief, and that this is an opportunity for us, if we're going to submit it, for example, as part of the motion, outside of the service, let's get it not perfect, because perfect is the enemy of good, but let's get it to be more useful to us. And in that vein, if it's helpful, I can't do a lot of the out-of-office work, but I'm happy to work with folks in the service to review the next version of the report and give feedback along the way as to what I think might, and consult with my colleagues, might make it stronger.
So what is the wish of colleagues here? Because we have a motion on the
Sorry, I still
table.
wanted to talk about one more of the
Yep, go ahead,
But
sorry.
we've left in the middle of 13, and the chief wanted to respond. He was.
All the comments.
Oh, okay.
Yep, thanks.
So the other piece that I had a comment on was number 23, which is directed to the Ministry of Health and the service. And we had this discussion at our last meeting as well in terms of the scope and expansion of mobile crisis teams. So I know that, the mental health subcommittee was forwarded the MCIT quality improvement and expansion evaluation. We know it's working well. I would really like to see some focus on this to see what is possible in terms of expanding MCIT, and especially considering in what scenarios could this be a primary response. I fully understand when there's a weapon involved, it can't be, but I would really like to see the options around when would it be possible for us to have a rapid response team like in Hamilton.
That works very much like ours, a mobile crisis team with a uniformed police officer and a medical nurse or social worker that will attend on a call with uniformed police officers. So that's very much like our model. They have a second model called COAST, which is basically they're not a crisis response model. People call their 24-hour action line or request line, and they either make an appointment if it's overnight, or if it's during the day, they still make an appointment that's amenable to both the client and the COAST team. So they're not first responders to individuals in crisis, much like our model is. And I'll just remind the board and the community that although we don't have possibly enough MCIT officers for some, we can guarantee you that anyone who calls the Toronto Police Service with regards to a person in crisis, they're going to be responded to by a professional, well-trained, empathetic police officer, whether or not they're joined by an MCIT team or not. So I'll just remind everybody as well, every week we respond to over 550 calls. 550 calls that nobody hears about because they end the way we want them to end. So I just want to raise that a little bit. So as far as the debriefing goes, that was one of the challenges, is because We have last year 27,500 calls, and we're well on the way to surpassing that. Officers practice de-escalation every single day, not only if it's in their, not only if they're responding to people in crisis, but there's a number of other calls where officers have to exercise negotiation skills. Domestic violence comes into mind, even vehicle stops occasionally. Even prisoners in our stations that either don't want to go into the cell or don't want to come out of the cell. It's a negotiation, so officers are doing this all the time. So I just want to remind you of that.
And again, I think, Chris, everybody recognizes, first of all, the huge challenge for the police and the fact that we're, the 24/7 responders, and that, as you say, it's growing at roughly 8% a year with no kind of ends in sight. And I think everybody acknowledges that we do a number of things extraordinary, but again, it is the target set by the Akabuchi that we want to get to zero harm, zero death. And so we want to move forward on that basis. So it's we commend the service for the excellent job they do. We want to help it go further, as you do too, I know.
As do we. It's a continued pursuit of excellence, as you know. We always want to learn.
Ms. Muller?
So following on that, based on the conversation you heard both before this item in this room, do you feel that you can go back and review, or is it your sense that you've given us as much information as the service is going to be able to provide? So I'm asking very candidly because I want to know how much more time you're going to say, okay, how do we frame it differently, but it's going to be the same thing. That's not what we're asking for. We're asking for a better response to the recommendations, including those places where we think you might be able to do more than
right. So the service can take a look at this and bring it back to the board.
So you're not submitting it for receipt today?
Well, what is the board's wish? Is it, normally we would take this and we've had the deposition, we would approve this. We had the suggestion that it go to the steering committee, which I think is a good one for another filter. But what is the wish of the board for the next stage here?
I can just expand on the number one motion, which is what I'd put forward. I think it's important that the steering committee that the board has already struck to look at the local recommendations have a look at this, but which is a separate issue from what you're raising, which is an opportunity for the service to resubmit.
And my only observation would be as soon as it goes into the public and the public sees the more than, like for more in-depth review, for example, at the interim steering committee, does that affect the perception of the committee about how the service is doing its work? So my preference would be, subject to it not causing a backlog elsewhere, that we give the service a chance to review the recommendations that they've put forward, see whether there is a way of reframing them. I'm happy to help in that if that's useful, and then to look at that and then refer that document to the interim steering committee. I don't feel super strongly about it. I just think that we should put the best information forward, especially to people who have not been part of the process.
Chief Saunders?
Yeah, and just in light of recommendation number one, I think if there's more work at the front end, it would alleviate a lot of work at the back end. So I concur.
So you concur that we should be...
When reports are written, a lot of times it is to appreciate the workload of the board, and so streamlining it becomes of essence, or else you're going to have 700 pages to go through each and every month, which we would gladly do if that's what you want. So there needs to be a balance struck between us with respect to content and information, and if there are opportunities where things can be given in advance, things could be clarified, and we could probably streamline through these things. So with this report, I certainly would entertain bringing it back, making modifications, and going from there.
So may we have a motion to that effect? Does anybody want to frame it? Ms. Muller?
So I move that the service bring the response to the jury recommendations in the Andrew Locu inquiry back to the board at, and I'm going to turn to you. I don't know, do we have till June? I know this inquiry has a number of domino effects on, and the information, the steering committee is coming forward with terms of reference. So
I don't, I think it's a question of getting it right at this stage.
Okay.
So the answer is yes.
Okay. So the motion would then bring back to the June board meeting. And then the other two recommendation motions, I leave that to Upala, if you propose them. I don't know whether they're still timely.
Just wondering then, do we move the rest of it at June? We hold
Well,
these motions till June?
but I think to some degree, can't they go forward in parallel? So that, in effect, what is here now is given to the committee. The service is going back in light of the conversations that we've had here to review it. The new committee, which is just forming itself now, can be apprised of that and have input into it, which will help the service in their response coming back in June. Is that not fair?
My suggestion was around the recommend motions 2 and 3.
Sorry, there was to recommend.
Do we proceed with those? If the service is bringing back a report in June, do we proceed with motions 2 and 3 today? And I guess number 3, no. Because
Number 3, no, but number
that.
2 I thought kind of like, which is the, you know, to get as much information as we can from the province, if they've got it, about de-escalation. Presumably that's helpful to you, Deputy McLean, and so. Marie, do you want to phrase your motion again? Just so.
So I would, the
you
first
capture
motion,
it
I
by
don't know if
Carlene?
Carlene, if you can read back the first motion. This is the new motion number 1. And number 2 would remain the same, and we would remove number 3. For reconsideration and brought forward at the June board meeting.
So, I can't read that over there.
We're deleting number 2 and deleting number 3 and retaining the original number 2. So delete that. We're keeping the original number 2, which you're highlighting.
Okay, so we're deleting this one?
Correct. And we're deleting the last one. I think that's good.
Do you want to read it to us, because since I can't see what the first part is there, otherwise I'd read it myself.
That the report be referred back to the chief for reconsideration and brought forward to the June board meeting.
Oh God, and then we proceed with number 2, which is in recognition that the jury, recommendation number 37, that the ministry take the lead in a study for, oh God, there it goes again. Okay. Now I can't read it at all, so.
I can read it
we've all
from
seen
here.
it. Okay, can you?
In recognition that the jury recommends in recommendations number 37, I can't read it anymore, okay, that the ministry take the lead in study, I'm not sure that's, I understand that, that the ministry take the lead in studying and consideration of the UK's non-use of force de-escalation methods, that the chair of the board formally requests that the ministry share any research reports that may arise within the Toronto that may arise with the, share the reports with the Toronto Police Services Board.
And this comes out of the joint the number 37 recommendations. So that is the resolution, colleagues. Chief Saunders, you're comfortable with that and the time frame? Deputy McLean? Okay. Marie, you're putting that forward. May I have a seconder? Councillor Lee, all in favor? Any contrary? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Deputy McLean, Inspector Buddy, appreciate it. So that, that's, Councillor Carroll, you had item number 12 held, which is the jury response recommendation, coroner's inquest into the death of Eric Ozawa.
Yeah, it was just a quick question because the report talks at length about and recommends that we continue researching weapons, but it speaks sort of in generalities without ever specifically hunted through the report for a specific reference of this specific sling was reviewed. We're confident that it won't discharge again and we're still using it, or we're not confident and we're not using it. I read the whole report without knowing, could this happen again? Do we know? Is the sling still in use, and are we confident that it won't happen again?
Oh, here come the experts.
If Sergeant Forstall.
Can you ask the question again, Councillor?
Yeah, it's about, the report goes into detail and the recommendation goes into detail of continuing that the board should, or not the board, the service should continuously research less lethal weapons of force and weapons in general. But I couldn't find in the report a specific mention of, we have now reviewed this sling and are confident that if we continue to use it, it won't go off again. Or we don't use this sling because we evaluated it and it will shoot someone again. What do we know about this sling? Are we still using them?
We are not using the Y-sling. The Y-sling was taken out of service shortly after the incident. We have gone basically to two other versions of the sling itself.
That would have been the most important thing to put on the very first page of this report. And it's not you, I've been saying this since 8:30 this morning. We have got to get to the point where if we want to come together, board and service, that the most salient point is on the first page, in the first two paragraphs. That is all I wanted to know once this incident was described to me, and I could not find it. I might not have read the whole report if I'd seen that in the first paragraph. I'd have been done right there. For future reference, it will just make life so much easier.
With that, Councillor Carroll, may we have a motion to approve? Councillor Carroll, thanks, Mike. Seconded, Ms. Molnar, all in favor? Any contrary? Thank you. That takes us to item number 15. Councillor Lee, you had that. That's the vendor of record and the laptop equipment software, et cetera, the extension of the contract.
Yes, thank you. I got questions. Now, this 2 years, you're not reading it correctly. When I look at the table, 25%, 25%, but it doesn't look like it's equal in year 1 and year 2. For example, the book stations, 11, 13, year 2, 7, 15. So why the 25% is so different in 2 years? The same with all the other numbers.
Some of it is like in the ones on the bottom, you'll see that the numbers are smaller because we do testing 1 year and then move forward with the purchase the following year. But the ones that I think you're talking about, the workstations and the laptops, it all depends on when we bought them before. So on average, we keep those about 4 years, which is the 25%. Okay. So we may have bought some for a particular purpose.
So, and that's, so this 25% average is over a long period
really
of
what the 25% signifies is a 4-year life cycle.
Yeah. Well, then if we are reviewing the purchasing, going with the city, why are we not doing it with the workstations, laptops, and the mobile workstations?
Right now, we're focusing strictly on the printers. But there is, part of the shared services will look at shared services or shared purchasing for the other endpoint devices like workstations down the line. Mobile workstations
What's the
would be
timeline for that?
we tried it probably about 7 years ago. It didn't work out that well. So now we're going back. We're probably looking in the next year or two. So this kind of buys us time until that review is complete. If the review, though, and let's say we participate in something sooner, then we are not bound by this contract. We can get out of this.
So we can get out of the 2
and
years,
move into
even
the
though
citywide contract.
I would have liked to go 1 year, 1 year, 1 + 1 plus. Okay, if you think that we can get out of it,
yes,
then
definitely.
I got no problem moving it then. Thank you.
Then Councillor Lee, will you move?
I'll move the recommendation.
The approval of item 15. So Councillor Lee moves it, seconded by? Seconder, Ms. Molnar, all in favor? Any contrary? Item number 21 was held because there's a deputation, but Derek Moran is not here. So may I have a motion to receive item 21 in his absence? Councillor Lee, seconded. Mr. Jeffers, all in favor? Any contrary? That takes us to the final hold with Councillor Lee. You were the annual report on the audit and quality assurance.
Again, I'm reading through all these reports, and who's verifying that it's done properly? I mean, do we have the Auditor General coming in here to review the internal audit reports?
Actually, the Auditor General does not have jurisdiction under the City of Toronto Act for the Toronto Police or the the Library Board, but we do have a close relationship with them. These are audits that we do an environmental scan in terms of identifying risks through a number of different processes, and then we basically develop a risk-based work plan and report out to the chief. It's intended to give the chief and indirectly the board assurance that the areas that we looked at are actually working well.
Yeah.
Audits that the city does, we leverage, and so if they do an audit of, let's say, the TTC or city division, we actually look at those and make sure that the problems don't exist, and if they do, to correct them here as well.
Well, I think you're familiar that at city we do have an audit committee to review the reports. On the board, we don't have subcommittee.
Correct.
Audit subcommittee, but do you think it's a good idea to have such a subcommittee at the board?
I'd like some time to think about it in terms of the framework and how it works. Remember, at the city, the Auditor General is basically providing assurance to City Council, and then you have an internal audit function that actually provides assurance to the City Manager. This is what our function is, very much in tune with the City internal audit function that provides assurance to the Chief. Having said that, I mean, it's something that the board, if they choose, can certainly look at.
Okay, thank you. With that,
I think that's a good suggestion that perhaps we should look at, because certainly best practices in industry is a co-equal line, if that's the right word, from an audit function, both to, not directly to the board, but a subcommittee of the board, and to the CEO at the same time. Well, the chief is the CEO in this case. We lack that, and so best practices would indicate that we should do it. If you wish to propose that, that's...
And with that, I'll leave it with the chair, because I may not be here much longer.
I will take that nice pass. We'll work on that, the executive director and I, and we will come back to you at the next meeting. So with that, may we have a motion, Councillor Lee, to receive the item number 23?
Yep.
And a seconder for that, Ms. Molnar? Sure. All in favor? Any contrary? So that concludes the agenda.
I'm sorry, did I miss? I thought someone had held the conducted energy weapon annual report.
Nope, no one did.
So may I ask just that perhaps the service member who either wrote or who knows it could come up and explain to us the specific data around the use of it against emotionally disturbed people, which is quite a significant percentage.
Can we then reopen the item?
Yes,
so
please.
You're making a motion,
Thank
seconded
you.
by Councillor Lee. All in favor? Any contrary? Chief, is there an expert still here that can address that issue? It should be relatively straightforward.
If we could just stand by for a minute.
Yep.
Notwithstanding that, I do understand the importance of the questions, and so certainly willing to bring it up next month and start the conversation there.
And I'm happy to bring it back next month if that makes the most sense. From we've left it late in the day and I didn't catch it earlier, so it's my bad, but I assumed that we would want to discuss it.
Can we just procedurally hold the question over, Joanne, until the next?
Okay.
Okay, well, colleagues, is that what you want to do? We'll defer consideration of the report to the next meeting? Or wait a minute, Deputy McLean is here. Would your other Deputy McLean answer?
No, I'm fine.
And my specific observation, others may have, is the data, which not surprisingly confirms the information we have that CWs tend to be used more often than not, and significantly, if you understand the numbers here, which I'm not sure I do, against people who are described as EMD and emotionally disturbed. And I can't remember what Ms. Chandrasekhara suggested should be the alternate.
Well, listen, just Deputy McLean is here and can't answer, but we can, since we've reopened the item, we can do anything we want with it. You've alluded to the fact that Ms. Chandrasekhara is not here. She has a specific interest in that. Do we want to just hold it then, defer it till the next meeting? Which would then allow her to participate as well. Colleagues?
Can we just hear from staff? There will be regular reports coming
Yes,
forward.
there will be.
There
Yep.
will be regular reports coming forward as a result of the CEW pilot.
Yep.
So maybe you want to refer this forward for consideration at the same time of the first quarterly report of the pilot. And then you'll be looking at the pilot and how it's going to be deployed, and usage and or overusage all in one fell swoop. Would that be fairly soon, or is that a long way down the road?
First off, it's not a pilot project, it's full implementation, but over the next period of time, there's going to be some aggressive timelines with reporting to the board with what the landscape is with more of these tools that are provided to the organization.
So with that, it was a quarterly request.
It was quarterly for,
Yeah.
I think quarterly for 18 months.
Yes.
And then further review
Right.
After that.
So it's when the first quarterly, when did the clock start ticking? Was it?
We're anticipating the first, no, so training will start mid-May, so the first ones will be out on the street mid-May, and we're anticipating our first quarterly report in September.
So then there's a motion to defer item number, what item is it?
21?
22, defer it to the April meeting, proposed by Ms. Mulliner, seconded by Mayor Tory. All in favor? Any contrary? Any other business? Motion to adjourn. Councillor Lee. You don't get to do it. Deputy McLean, nice try. Seconder for that, Mayor Tory. Everybody, thank you very much for your involvement and participation.